Hello, and welcome to this clean historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. The Desperate Bride's Journey by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1, New York, 1881. Do that again, and you'll feel my belt on the back of your legs. I'll make sure you won't be able to sit down for a week. 8-year-old Finley Doyle shrank from his stepfather's stern gaze and hastily put the second bread roll he had been about to eat back on the plate at the center of the table. "Sorry, Pa," he stuttered. "I was hungry and I forgot my manners. It won't happen again. I'm sure we can spare a bit of bread for him, can't we, Everett? He needs to eat plenty or he'll get sick." Sylvia shot an anxious look between her overbearing husband and her son, hoping that the evening hadn't been ruined by Finley's careless actions. "Of course you would stick up for the little wretch, wouldn't you?" Sylvia's gaunt cheeks flushed. "He's doing his best, Everett. Leave him be." "Is he really, though? I'm working my fingers to the bone to keep a roof over our heads. The boy's old enough to be out working too, but look at him. A pasty, scrawny excuse for a son. If I'd known then what I know now, I never would have married you." Everett Doyle threw down his knife and fork, sending them ricocheting across the table, and his eyes narrowed with anger. "I promise I didn't trick you. I really was expecting your baby." "Were you really?" Everett stood up, towering over his frail wife. "Seems to me you were just looking for any old fool to take you in and provide for you and your 2 brats. I rue the day I ever took pity on you after Seamus died. And what a useless man he was, too. Useless, the lot of you." His voice rose up several notches as he warmed to his favorite subject. "It's not as if you've even rewarded me with a son of my own, is it? You say you lost the baby. I'm not so sure. Maybe you just said that to make sure I'd marry you." Sylvia flinched as her husband's harsh words rained down on her, trying not to think about how gentle and kind her first husband Seamus had been by comparison. "That's not fair. My real pa was a good man. Everyone says so." Finley could take no more, and he jumped up to defend the memory of his late father. "Hush, Finn. Sit down." Sylvia grabbed her son's arm and gently pushed him back onto his seat. "Everett is a fine, upstanding man, and we're very lucky that he looks after us so well." Her words came out in a rush, devoid of feeling. She knew that if she didn't pander to Everett's ego, she would have another bruise to add to her collection when he thought nobody was looking. The air at the table crackled with tension, and Sylvia blinked back her tears. Everett hated it when she cried, so she forced herself to swallow a tiny mouthful of bread instead. She stole a look at the clock on the mantel. 7 o'clock. Any moment now, she told herself. I'm back, and you'll never guess what I've got. Right on cue, the door to their tenement apartment creaked open, and Annie Doyle bustled through with a basket over her arm. Her auburn hair curled around her face, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold wind that was blowing straight off the harbor water, scattering leaves from the trees and sending them swirling around people's ankles as they hurried home. "Oh, come in and get warm, honey. I was starting to worry that you were late." Sylvie felt relief wash over her at the sight of her daughter. "Was the market busy today?" "Uh-huh. There are so many ships coming from England at the moment with people looking for a new life here in New York. I've never seen the docks so busy. All the better for us, though." Annie hung her shawl on the hook behind the door and brought the basket over to the table. "I made a bit extra today. The apples looked so tempting at the moment that I sold out and had to get more." Mr. Roche, the butcher, put a lovely piece of beef by for us. With the vegetables I managed to save from being thrown away yesterday, that'll make a tasty stew that should last us a few days and put a bit of color back in your cheeks, Ma. Sylvie could smell the crispness of fall on Annie's hair as her daughter bent to give her a hug. "Bless you, Annie," she whispered so that only she would hear. As Annie pulled away, she held her gaze for a beat, and a moment of understanding passed between them. "Why don't you put your feet up, Pa? Let me bring you a coffee by the fire." Annie fixed a smile onto her face and stared at her bullying stepfather. She had felt her ma wince as she touched her shoulder and knew without asking that he had given her another thump when he had been drunk the night before. "I expect you've had a busy day at the brewery. You deserve a rest. Glad to see one of you has noticed how hard I work." Everett's face returned to its usual sullen expression, and he shot Sylvia a contemptuous look. "I'm going out. Don't wait up. Never mind deserving a rest. What I deserve is a family who respects me. But seeing as I ain't got that, I'm going to the bar for whiskey instead." The thin walls of their apartment shuddered as he slammed the door closed behind him and stomped down the stairs, eager to get to his favorite bar where he could forget himself in the amber depths of the drink that he craved. "I'm sorry, Finley. He doesn't mean to be mean to us." Sylvia's eyes looked troubled as she tried to reassure her son. The midwife had warned her that he might never be a healthy child on the memorable night when she had gone into labor, and he had arrived weeks earlier than he should have done, scrunched and red-faced as he howled with indignation. But Sylvia had cradled him to her chest and thanked the Lord. She was just grateful she hadn't lost him when she was still only a few months along, like she had with 3 of the other little souls she hadn't been able to carry to full term. "Ah, don't worry, Ma. I don't mind, really. He'll cheer up as soon as I'm old enough to start an apprenticeship, I'm sure. I'm going to be the best carpenter in the neighborhood. Just you wait and see." Finley grinned at his ma and big sister Annie. "Reckon I might build us a sweet little cabin way out in the countryside one day, and we can all enjoy the fresh air to help you feel better, Ma. Just like in those books you love reading so much." Sylvia gave him an indulgent smile, letting him enjoy his daydreaming. A little bit of escapism from Everett's bad temper was what they all needed lately. "Annie's nearly 20. She'll be married with a family of her own by the time you're old enough to be a carpenter. But maybe one day, oh, how I would love for you to do that for us. Just think, we could grow our own vegetables in the garden and have a picket fence and a porch to sit on in the evening." "Hang on a minute. Who's to say I wouldn't like to join you out in the countryside, too?" Annie replied with a giggle. "Maybe there would be a handsome doctor or an apothecarist at the little town nearby who might call in to welcome us to the area. And he'd smell your pound cake baking and insist on asking you to take a walk with him by the river after church." Sylvia's eyes gleamed as she played along in what their imaginary new life would look like. "And I could have a little workshop in town, and we would take you for a ride in our wagon on Sunday afternoons to call at our new neighbors when you're old and gray, Ma. Best of all, it would just be the 3 of us, and we'd never have to worry about being shouted at ever again." Finley's smile faltered as he realized that their dream would never come true, with Everett ruling the family with an iron fist. He was as healthy as an ox in spite of being drunk almost every evening, so they were stuck with him. "Just the 3 of us," Sylvia whispered. Her eyes clouded, and without thinking, she raised her hand to the fading purple bruise on her cheek. "Maybe he won't be drunk tonight," Annie said quietly once Finley had started clearing the table. She helped Sylvia to the wingback chair where she would be more comfortable and threw a lump of coal on the fire before tucking a threadbare blanket over her knees. Since her last illness, she had lost an alarming amount of weight, and Annie could feel she was like skin and bone under the gray dress that now hung loose on her. "I wouldn't mind if it was just me. He took it out on, but just lately he's gotten a nasty streak toward Finley, too." Sylvia shivered and reached for one of the well-thumbed penny romance books she loved to escape into by the flickering light of the oil lamp. "I'm scared that one day he'll go too far," she muttered to herself. "I won't let him, Ma. Let me handle his bad tempers as much as I can. The main thing is for you to get your strength up and for Finley to keep out of his way. I'm going to start asking around at the market to see if there's an easy job that Finley could do that won't set off his coughing. Maybe that will be enough to keep Pa happy." As Annie bustled around, tidying the apartment and preparing the stew for the following day, she couldn't help wondering how much longer they could go on like this. Since Everett's arm had been crushed by a falling barrel at his job at the brewery, and he had been put on light duties instead, he had become like a stranger to them. Drink, drink, and more drink. That's all he cares for. Annie felt bad for the thought that popped into her head, but there was no denying it was true. After the accident, he had started drinking most nights, spending money they could ill afford on the whiskey he claimed he needed to help with the pain. Although he had always had a quick temper, now his bad moods never seemed to leave him, and she couldn't bear to see her darling Ma being reduced to a shell of her former cheerful self. The final straw had been Sylvia's last failed pregnancy, which had ended early with her almost dying from blood loss. Everett hadn't been able to conceal his contempt for Sylvia and his stepchildren since that fateful day, and Annie felt helpless to change anything for the better. Why is he always so angry with us? Annie jumped as she realized Finley had sidled into the small kitchen area to help her. He had always been able to read her emotions, and she knew there was no point denying it. "I guess it's hard bringing up another man's children," she said gently. "He wasn't always like this. When you were younger, we used to have picnics in the summer, and one time he and Ma went ice skating when the river froze over. The accident hit him hard. Even though his arm is better, he'll never be able to do the type of work he did before. For a man like him, I reckon his pride is dented. It's just hard that he takes it out on Ma. I wish I could start earning money to support." Finley's words broke off as he was seized with one of the coughing fits that frequently shook his narrow frame. "You'll be able to, soon enough." Annie tousled his hair and passed him a glass of water. "I'll just have to do longer hours at the market until then. We need more money coming in, and I'm not afraid of hard work," she added stoutly. Will it ever be enough to keep Everett happy, though? The thought slid into her mind as she recalled Everett's sour expression before he had left for the evening. He was spending the money on drink as fast as she could earn it, and if he carried on, they were in danger of not being able to pay the rent. She knew that if they ended up in the poorhouse, Sylvia and Finley would never survive, and she was determined not to let that happen. Chapter 2. "Here you go, Annie. Have these on the house, and give your ma my best wishes. We miss seeing her out and about." Mrs. Roche popped a box of eggs into Annie's basket on top of the oxtails she had collected to make a nourishing broth, waving away her attempt to pay for them. Mr. Roche smiled at his wife. "Maggie is right. It's the least we can do for a family friend. Now get along home now before it gets any darker. Reckon we're in for a decent fall of snow tonight if that sky's anything to go by." He stood on the doorstep of his shop, glancing at the leaden gray clouds that pressed down over the city. Annie waved goodbye and hurried along the street with her head bent against the icy wind. They didn't have any relations in New York, so a kind word from friends like the Roches made her day a little more bearable. Winter had come early, and her hands were already chapped and red from the unseasonable cold. It felt as though fall, her favorite season, had only lasted a few weeks, and her stomach was knotted with worry about how much worse this would be for her ma. "She's not looking too good, Annie. I've tried to give her a hot drink, but I don't think it's making any difference." Finley's worry was etched on his young face as he ran to take the basket from her a few minutes later. And Annie's heart sank at his words. She had been lucky to have had their ma in her life for all of her 20 years, but she knew that Finley would not be so fortunate. The smell of illness was seeping from the very walls of their apartment, and no matter how hard she prayed, she feared that their darling ma did not have much longer on this earth. "Annie, is that you?" Sylvia tried to lift her head from where she rested against the thin pillows, but the effort was too much. Annie had dragged the narrow bed in front of the hearth and instructed Finley to keep the fire going to keep her warm. But even from across the room, Annie could see that Sylvia's skin had a mottled blue pallor, and the feeble heat was doing little to keep the chill away. Worse still, Sylvia's breathing had started to sound even more labored than when Annie had left for the market that morning. She was going downhill fast. "I'm back, Ma, and I'm going to make you a delicious oxtail broth to make you better." Annie sat gingerly on the bed next to Sylvia, and grasped her hands, trying to rub some circulation back into them. They felt like 2 blocks of ice, but when Annie gently pressed the back of her hand to Sylvia's forehead, the skin felt as if it was burning. "Mr. and Mrs. Roche send their regards to you, Ma. They reckon we'll have snow tonight. When you're better, I think we should go to the park and have roasted chestnuts. Won't that be fun?" Sylvia smiled weakly up at her children. "I remember when Seamus and I were courting, we loved to walk in the snow. He saved up and bought me the most beautiful scarf, and when he tied it around my neck, that was when he asked me to marry him. I wish. Her words trailed off as she fell into a feverish doze again. "Did you see Pa on your way home?" Finley glanced up nervously as he heard heavy footsteps on the shared stairs in the building, but they continued to the next floor, much to his relief. "No, thank goodness. He must have gone straight to the Claremont Tavern on his way back from work to spend his money on whiskey before I asked for it to buy food." Annie tried not to let the bitterness show in her tone. Since Sylvia had been confined to her bed this last week, Everett had scarcely been home, scurrying straight to the tavern after work instead, then stumbling back to their rooms after everyone was asleep. What if he loses his job at the brewery? How will we manage then? Finley had seen him leaving for work in the mornings, rough-shaven and reeking of stale liquor. "Honestly, I don't know," Annie replied quietly. She knew that Finley's weak chest wouldn't respond well to working at the market with her in the cold, and she was already working all the hours that she could. "Let's just do our best for Ma. That's what matters most at the moment. If I have to beg the landlord to wait a few weeks for the rent money, I will. I'm not too proud." She gave Finley a reassuring smile. "When the weather gets warm again in the spring, I'll help you find a job. Maybe something inside so we don't have to worry about you getting sick as well." "I wish I was working already, Annie. I want to help." Finley lifted his chin with a determined look on his face. "You're helping by being with Ma," Annie said quickly. "It's a great comfort to her, having you here, and it means I don't have to worry about what might happen if Pa returns and he's drunk." Finley nodded thoughtfully, and Annie put the kettle on the stove to boil. "Let's have a cup of coffee. Then you should get some sleep. I'm going to sit with Ma tonight in case she wakes up confused." She bit the rest of her words back. What she meant was that she didn't want Sylvia to die alone, but she couldn't bring herself to say that to Finley in case uttering the words aloud made it more likely to happen that night. "Lord, please spare Ma from death for a little while longer. Finley needs her, and I do too." Annie whispered her plea, sitting alone with Sylvia an hour later. She could feel her eyes closing as she fought off the sleep that wanted to claim her. Even though she felt dog-tired from being on her feet all day, she wanted to stay awake for every moment she had left with her Ma. "Don't be afraid, Annie. I'll never really leave you." Sylvia's eyes fluttered open, and she let her gaze rest on the work-worn face of her eldest child. She reached for Annie's hand and gave it a slight squeeze. The clock ticked on the mantel shelf, and quietness wrapped itself around them both in the darkest hour of the night. "I love you, sweet girl. Never forget that. You've been the best daughter I could have wished for." Her words were cut off by a rattling wheeze as she struggled to catch her breath. "Hush, Ma. Save your strength for getting better." Annie leaned forward and brushed a kiss on Sylvia's cheek. The skin felt waxy and cold, but her eyes still burned bright. "Let me speak. I don't have much longer." Sylvie gave her daughter a pleading look, and Annie nodded. "Look after Finley, Annie. He needs you to be strong after I've gone." She took a slow breath, and her eyes started to lose focus. "I want you both to be happy. Don't make the same mistake I made and settle for a husband who isn't a kind, honest man. I thought Everett would be all right, but when his mettle was tested, he turned away from the Lord's ways. It's not what your real pa would have wanted. Look for someone like him, and you'll be as happy as Seamus and I were." "I won't, Ma. Besides, marriage isn't on my mind. Looking after Finley is more important." "No, Annie, listen to me." Sylvie's face creased with the effort of speaking. "I want you to marry a good man and look after Finley, that's what I mean. Get away from here, from Everett." She could barely bring herself to say his name. "Just remember our dream of a little cabin in the country is all I'm saying." Annie leaned in closer to hear Sylvia's whispered words, but her voice was getting weaker by the moment, and her breathing was becoming more labored. The wind whined through the creaky timbers of the building, sending icy fingers of cold where the windows were cracked and making the flames leap in the fire. Outside, snowflakes started to fall, slowly at first, but gathering pace as the minutes ticked by. Shadows jumped on the wall behind Annie, and she leaned forward to smooth the hair from Sylvia's fevered brow. "I'll always remember our dream, Ma. Godspeed. The Lord is waiting for you, and I promise Finley and I will live well in your memory." Her words came out barely above a whisper, and as Sylvia's breathing got shallower, eventually followed by silence, she knew that her darling Ma had already gone to that place where she would never again see the light in her eyes or hear her laughter. Annie pulled the Bible into her lap and let it fall open, seeking strength for what lay ahead. "Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." The comforting words jumped out at her, and she felt the heaviness in her heart lighten a tiny bit. No matter what life had in store for her, she knew that she and Finley would be all right with the Lord's help, and that Sylvia would be safe in the Lord's love after ending her time on earth. Chapter 3. Get up, you idle layabout. Annie woke with a start as she heard Everett kick Finley's bed with a juddering crash of his boot. "Quit looking like a whipped dog and make me some coffee. How am I meant to keep a roof over our heads if I have to do household chores as well?" She wriggled quickly into her dress and coiled her hair up, hurrying through to the kitchen. "Sorry, Pa. I overslept. Let me fix a coffee and something for you to eat." She rubbed the sleep from her eyes, peering out at the snow-blanketed street below. "Ain't got time for that," Everett groused. "Just give me a coffee. I can't stomach anything else." He ran a hand across his bloodshot eyes and slumped on the chair, drumming his fingers impatiently. Finley appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, and Annie could tell that he had been crying, just like he had every night since Sylvia had died 2 weeks ago. "Sorry, Pa. It won't happen again." He sidled past Everett and picked up the sodden jacket from where he had flung it in the corner the night before in his drunken carelessness. "Let me just put this by the fire to dry for a few minutes." He added a couple of lumps of coal to the fire and riddled the embers to dispel the chill in the room. "What are you doing, boy? Piling up mountains of coal on the fire like we're made of money." Everett scowled at him, and Finley shrank back, not knowing what to do. "Sorry, Pa." "Sorry, Pa? Sorry, Pa?" Everett mimicked with a cruel taunt in his voice. "If I hear those words one more time, I'll give you a thick lip to shut you up, son. I'm in charge now, your ma's gone, and it's about time things changed around here. She was always too soft with you, Finley, and I ain't about to make the same mistake. Here's your coffee, Pa. Finley, why don't you come with me to the market today, and I'll make some introductions to the other traders. If you wrap up warm, I'm sure they'll have some odd jobs you can do to earn a few extra coins." Annie jerked her head, signaling for him to get ready, and he shot her a grateful look as he excused himself, glad to escape from Everett's endless criticism. "I meant what I said," Everett said sourly, watching Finley leave the room. "We need more money coming in, and he's like a millstone around my neck, that boy. It's time he went out to work properly instead of being mollycoddled at home every time the weather's cold or wet. I suppose you'd be happier if he were in the graveyard with Ma? One less mouth to feed is all you care about." Annie snapped. Her patience was wearing thin with Everett's foul moods, and the words came out before she could stop them. "If you weren't throwing good money away on whiskey and gambling every night, we would have enough for the rent and food." Everett leapt to his feet with the speed of a striking snake. He covered the floor between them in 2 long strides and pinned her to the wall. "You don't speak to me like that, you ungrateful hussy." He put one hand around her throat and started to squeeze, enjoying the look of fear in her eyes. "A man can get lonely without a wife if you get my meaning," he said quietly. His eyes bored into her, and his mouth curled into a lustful smile. The air around him stank of stale whiskey and desperation, and Annie wondered where the man who had once been kind and considerate to them had gone. "Get off me, you disgusting brute." Annie glared at him, not wanting to show her terror. "You might have bullied Ma, but I won't let you bully me and Finley." She twisted from his grip and sprang backward to put some distance between them. "Brave words for a girl with no other options," he chuckled. "I was going to tell you yesterday, but I got distracted at the tavern, so I may as well share my good news now instead." "What good news?" Annie felt a shiver of apprehension at his sudden change of attitude. "I was speaking to a man at the tavern the other night, at a card game. I owe him a few dollars." "You mean you've got us into more debt?" Annie snapped. Everett waved her concerns away. "It ain't no business of yours what I do with my time. But this gentleman has agreed to waive my debt as long as Finley goes to work for him. He's got a factory and needs a young lad to look after the machines who doesn't care about a bit of dirt and smoke." "No," Annie shot back at him. "Finley can't work in a factory like that, and you know it. The bad air would set his lungs off and make him sick within a week. Ma would never have agreed to such a thing, so you'll just have to tell this gentleman friend of yours that you'll pay him another way." She folded her arms in defiance, trying to ignore the shiver of fear that ran down her back. "Too late for that, I'm afraid," Everett replied nonchalantly with a mocking smile. "We already shook on it, and I told him Finley would be delighted to start whenever he likes." He gave Annie a shrug and turned on his heel, grabbing his coat to leave. "Like I said, things are changing around here now. Sylvia's gone, starting with that sniveling boy pulling his weight and earning some money for me." He pulled his coat on and downed the coffee that Annie had given him. "I won't allow it," Annie replied. "Let Finley come and work at the market with me instead. Please, Pa, I'm begging you. I know I can find some jobs that would suit Finley just fine, and if he's with me, I can keep an eye on him. And we'll find another way to pay your gambling debt. Just promise you won't play cards again and make it even worse." Everett gave her a steady look, and Annie wondered for one moment whether her plea had made him come to his senses. "It's all arranged," he drawled. "I'm an upstanding man of my word, Annie, and if I shake on something, how would it look if I change my mind? Finley can start at the beginning of the month, and he'll be given a bed to sleep on at the factory as well. He's plenty old enough to manage away from home now." He buttoned his jacket and gave Annie a slow smile. "And then it will just be you and me here, Annie. Who knows what might happen? You're a good-looking woman, and I'd hate for some penniless chancer at the market to get what should be rightfully mine after taking care of you and your family all these years." Annie felt her hackles rise as she watched him leave. Her poor Ma had scarcely been gone for 2 weeks, and it felt like their lives were falling apart because of Everett's shameless habits. She shuddered as she imagined what it would be like with Finley gone and how hard it would be for him to work in a dirty, smoky factory. "I have to make a plan to get us away from here." The words forced their way into her mind, and she knew they couldn't stay. She had no idea what they would do or where they would go, but she was determined to keep her brother safe, just like she had promised her Ma on her deathbed. With her mind whirling, she called to Finley to be quick so they could get a head start at the market. "Who can help us? Who would want to take me on with a sickly brother to care for as well?" A torrent of questions filled her head like a swarm of bees, and she took a deep breath to try to calm herself. She had no other family she could turn to, and if she didn't figure something out quickly, it might be too late. She decided she would just have to put her pride to one side and ask her friends the Roaches if they had any ideas. Chapter 4. Blossom Creek, Montana. Robert Gilligan hitched his mare outside the Hawthorne Saloon on the dusty side street of Blossom Creek and dismounted from the saddle, giving the horse a pat on her neck as he left. The wind had a keen edge to it, and he tightened his coat. Fall had arrived, and winter wouldn't be far behind. "Morning, ma'am." He raised his hat politely to the librarian on the sidewalk, not noticing her blush as she hurried on to her destination with her heart aflutter. His brooding, dark, good looks were not something he cared to think about, even though plenty of folks over the years had told him he could have the pick of any woman if he chose. He had decided long ago that life was already complicated enough trying to make Pine Tree Ranch financially secure, let alone adding the mysterious ways of women and romance into the mix. Not that a decision like that is irreversible, Robert. Otherwise, What's the point of it all if you die without an heir? The thought, which had been popping up in his mind with annoying regularity recently, nudged at him again, and his mouth lifted in a rueful smile. Sometimes he could be his own worst enemy. Lately, he had started to wonder if the decision to stay single when he first took on the ranch was still the right one. It was a lonely life out there by himself, day after day. But the thought of trying to fit a lengthy courtship of a Blossom Creek lady into his busy days quickly put a dampener on any yearnings to do something about his situation. He strolled through the town, pausing to talk to the people he knew. Usually, he only came in every few weeks when his supplies were running low, but even though he was reserved, he enjoyed the chance to catch up with friends and acquaintances and put the world to rights. He had only been at Blossom Creek for 8 years, but folks had gradually warmed to him, impressed by his determination to make something of the ranch, and now he was considered as much one of the locals as anyone. "Robert, hold up, I need to tell you something." The sound of heavy footsteps made him turn around, and he saw Fred Hopkins waving him down. "I see you're in town doing the same as us," Fred called as he got closer. "Charity said she needed sugar and dried fruits for our Christmas pound cake. It was her housekeeper's special recipe back east. And boy, there's no stopping Charity when she wants to get baking. Not that I'm complaining," he added with a chuckle, patting his stomach. "How are you all doing, Fred? Congratulations on the new baby." Robert gave Fred a hearty slap on his shoulder and saw his friend's face light up with pleasure. He was surprised by the sudden pang of regret that gripped him as he realized that everyone except him seemed to be happily married and growing their families. "Charity's taken to ranch life and motherhood like a duck to water," Fred replied with a proud smile. "You ought to try it yourself, you know. I was in two minds after losing my first wife, Lauren, but finding Charity and taking a second chance was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not a day goes by that I don't thank the Lord for bringing her into our lives." The clock in the park chimed the hour, and Robert glanced up the street. He still had a lot to do, and time was getting on. "I'm glad for you, Fred, but, there's nobody in Blossom Creek who's caught my eye, and winter's always a busy time on the ranch." His words trailed off, and he shrugged, knowing that they weren't strictly true. Other folks seemed to find the time to marry and start a family, so why not him? Fred saw the sheriff crossing the street and remembered what he had meant to say. "Anyway, I wanted to tell you to keep an eye out. I saw Old Man Ridley a few days ago, and he told me there are cattle rustlers about. The sheriff has mounted extra patrols in the district, but it's a big area to cover, and you know what it's like. They're in and out as quick as a flash." Fred's eyes clouded with concern. None of them could afford to lose the cattle they'd all worked so hard to raise. "Thanks for telling me, Fred. Guess we'd all better be on the lookout for strangers. Mind you, keep that lovely family of yours safe. I've had my run-ins with those types of men in the past, and they don't care who gets hurt as long as they get what they want." The two men parted company, and Robert continued toward the mercantile store to pick up the last few supplies he needed. His thoughts drifted back to the days before he had come to Blossom Creek, and he rubbed the scars on his cheek unconsciously. Rumors had swirled in Blossom Creek about how Robert had come by enough money to buy the scrubby tract of land and transform it into Pine Tree Ranch. He had always told them it was from getting lucky at the gold mines. But again, that wasn't strictly true. If people wondered about the scars on his hands and face, and the crookedness of his nose, where it had been broken many times, he brushed it off as a result of hard labor at the mines. They didn't need to know the real reasons for the way he looked, and he preferred to keep it that way. Except, I'll always be looking over my shoulder, won't I? The unwelcome thought trickled into his mind, and he shivered as the wind picked up again. At least if the sheriff was looking out for strangers around Blossom Creek, he had one less to worry about. He allowed his thoughts to linger for a moment longer on his life before Pine Tree Ranch and wondered briefly whether the choices he had made years ago might be coming home to roost. "Excuse me, are you looking for a few hours of fun?" A moll from one of the dubious saloons brushed past and flicked her dress with a suggestive smile, breaking into his thoughts. "Oh, no, ma'am. That's not my idea of fun." Robert gave an apologetic shrug, knowing that she would find a willing gentleman from the drinkers who lounged at the bar soon enough. The encounter reminded him just how far he had come from where he used to live, and he felt comforted by the thought that the chance of someone from his past catching up with him at the end of the long, winding track that led to his homestead was slim. He strode around the corner, and the wind blasted into his face, momentarily blinding him with dust and making him crash into the person who had just left the store. "Sorry, so sorry." Robert bent to help the woman retrieve her shopping from where it had scattered on the ground between them. "Oh, it's you, Robert." Charity Cuthbert hitched her baby higher in her arms and grinned up at him. "This weather is making Gregory grizzly, and I didn't even see you there, so it's probably my fault. I should have let the children carry the basket instead of trying to juggle it with the baby." Clara and John darted from behind Charity and quickly packed the shopping away again, giving Robert shy smiles. "I just saw Fred, and he told me about the cattle rustlers," Robert said quietly, not wanting to scare the children. "But never mind that. Show me your new arrival." Charity stepped into the shelter of the store's doorway and pulled the shawl back. Gregory had a whorl of brown hair and looked up at Robert with solemn eyes before rewarding him with a gummy smile. Robert stroked his downy cheek, and Gregory grinned wider, then clasped his tiny hand tightly around Robert's finger. Robert felt the pang of regret again and wondered what was coming over him. He had never felt strongly about having children until now, but something about seeing baby Gregory and how much Fred and Charity doted on him tugged at his heartstrings. He's as good as gold, and Clara and John have been so helpful, haven't they? Charity turned her warm gaze on her stepchildren, and they stood closer to keep the cold wind off Gregory, nodding enthusiastically. "He certainly looks like you, and Fred was as proud as Punch," Robert replied. He brushed his finger against Gregory's soft cheek again, and there was a wistful note in his voice that Charity couldn't fail to notice. "Why don't you speak to Mrs. Booth at the matrimonial agency, Robert? There's no shame in looking for a bride that way. Take me and Fred. If it weren't for the matrimonial times, we never would have found each other and had our happy ending." She gave him an encouraging smile. "I just saw her a few moments ago, and she asked if I knew of anyone who might need her services." "Oh, no. I don't think that would be for me. I don't have time, you see," Robert said hastily. "I mean, who would want? How would I know? What if the woman who replies isn't right?" "Fred had exactly those doubts, too," Charity interrupted. Gregory waved his pudgy fist in the air and started to whimper, so she rocked him in her arms to soothe him. "Well, we'd better get going. Just think about what I said, Robert. You're too lovely to be growing old alone out at the ranch. I know you have your mother to keep you company, but she won't be with you forever." She gave him a sympathetic look. "Besides, everyone needs somebody to love and look forward to the future with, don't they? Speak to Mrs. Booth. Go on. What have you got to lose?" Robert pushed his hat to the back of his head and watched Charity and the children walk briskly down the street toward their wagon. She was right, of course. He acknowledged reluctantly to himself. He didn't want to carry on being alone forever. He thought back to the quiet pride in Fred's face when he spoke of his family, and suddenly realized just how much he wanted a family of his own. And then seeing Gregory's chubby fist clutching his finger, he could only imagine what that might feel like if it were a baby of his own. The blinders had fallen from his eyes, making him see his protestations for the excuses they were, and he came to a sudden decision. It was now or never. "Can you get my groceries together for me, and I'll come back and fetch them shortly?" At the sound of Robert's question, Thomas and Myrtle Sutton looked up from behind the counter where they were sorting out a new delivery of flour and sugar. "Of course, Robert. We'll be happy to." Myrtle gave him a beaming smile and waved him away. "Take as long as you need. I know you don't get into town often." She watched him leave and hoped that it was because he had taken Charity's advice on board. She didn't like to pry, but she couldn't help overhearing the conversation between Mrs. Hopkins and Robert as she swept the fallen leaves from the front of the mercantile store she ran with her husband. She and Thomas had never been blessed with children of their own, but she had told Thomas on more than one occasion that if she'd had a son, she would have wanted one, just like Robert Gilligan. Robert hurried down the street, pulling his hat low to keep the dust from his eyes. His heart felt as though it wanted to jump out of his chest, and he chuckled at how ridiculous he was being. Glancing down the street to make sure nobody was watching, he slipped into the side street and arrived at the discreet door that he had passed many times but never taken much notice of. "Can I help you?" A plump woman appeared behind him, slightly breathless from where she had been in such a hurry. She reached for the door handle and pushed it open. "Are you here for the matrimonial agency?" She pointed at the wooden sign behind a large desk that announced the place to be the Happy Hearts Matrimonial Agency, painted in a swirling font. Nope, I was just passing." Robert edged backward and felt his cheeks flush as he realized this must be Mrs. Booth. "Don't be shy. They all say that." Mrs. Booth held the door open wider and propelled him in, before closing the door firmly behind them. Goodness me, that wind is cold enough to bring tears to my eyes. She hung her bonnet up and sat behind the desk, perching a pair of spectacles on the end of her nose. "How did you know that's what I was thinking about?" Robert gave her a sheepish look and twisted his hat in his hands. He felt too big for the chair she had pulled out for him and wondered whether there was still time to change his mind. "When you've dealt with affairs of the heart for as long as I have, I can spot a gentleman in need of a good wife in the blink of an eye, dear." She gave him a coy look and pulled a ledger toward her, flicking it open and reaching for a fountain pen. "Now then, let's get started, shall we, Mr. Gilligan? What sort of woman are you looking for? Who would you like to have by your side at Pine Tree Ranch?" A few minutes later, Robert found himself out on the street again, walking back to the mercantile store in a daze. For someone who looked like a sweet old lady, Mrs. Booth had an efficient manner and had quickly suggested the wording for his advertisement. She assured him that it would go in the very next edition of the Matrimonial Times, and that a fine catch like him would no doubt receive replies by return of post. "I find it's best to say that you'd like a willing, hard-working woman if you have a ranch," she had said, pen poised over the ledger, "and that you'd like to make a match sooner rather than later. Nobody likes these things to drag on for months on end, and we've got to consider that there might be snow quite soon, which could make the bride-to-be's journey difficult." Robert had nodded reluctantly, trusting that she knew best. "I rather thought nothing would happen until well after the winter," he had said hesitantly. Now that the longing in his heart was being turned into the words of the advertisement, with Mrs. Booth's embellishments, he felt a tremor of alarm. "I mean, I'll need a bit of time to get to know someone, as it's only by letter. I'd hate to rush into anything and make a mistake I can't get out of." Mrs. Booth had given him a reassuring pat on the hand. "Don't worry about a thing, Mr. Gilligan. You'll be pleasantly surprised by the caliber of young ladies who reply to a Happy Hearts advertisement. Many of the most loving marriages in this district started here in this office, you know. But I'm very discreet, so I can't say any more." She tapped the side of her nose, and her eyes sparkled with intrigue. She was well used to dealing with nervous bachelors and knew exactly how to nudge them into action to keep her little business running. "Should I say that I'm happy to wait until next spring or even next summer? Just leave the finer wording with me, dear. I'll make sure only the best sort of woman replies. And when she does, why would you want to wait a moment longer than necessary to meet your future love?" She had swiftly locked the coins he handed her into a money box and bade him farewell. "Another happy customer, Cupid. Now let's hope the perfect young lady replies to our advertisement, shall we?" She bent to stroke the small dog that was snoozing under her desk, and he gazed up at her with his fluffy ears pricked up at hearing his name. Mrs. Booth reached into the desk drawer and popped a chocolate into her mouth with a sigh of delight. She had helped many a reluctant rancher find love in her time, and knew from experience that the longer they had to stew over their decision, the more likely they were to back out of the agreement or ask her for a refund. Robert Gilligan needed a good woman in his life if the rumors in Blossom Creek were to be believed, and she considered it her moral duty to make sure he found the perfect wife. She added the final words to her advertisement with a flourish, before patting her gray curls and sitting back in her chair with a satisfied smile. If all went to plan, the future Mrs. Gilligan would be arriving in Blossom Creek in no time. Chapter 5, New York. We would have offered for you to come and live with us and Finley to work as a butcher's apprentice, but I don't want to give you false hope. Maggie Roche shot her husband a worried look as she pushed another slice of pie toward Finley. I'm sorry, Annie, but Maggie's right. This is the toughest year we've had in a long while, and we're barely keeping the business afloat and enough food on the table for the family. I understand, and I'm just grateful to have someone to confide in. I didn't expect you to support us, not when you've already got 4 of your own youngsters to look after. Annie pushed her panic down and squeezed Maggie's hand to show that she meant what she had said. The Roches were kind people, and she knew that they would have helped if they could. But since 2 new butchers had opened nearby, the competition had been fierce, and she had seen the worry etched on Ted's face when he had thought nobody was looking. Perhaps it won't be so bad at the factory? I hear some of them are trying harder to improve conditions now. Maggie's words trailed off, and she shook her head, wishing she could do more to help. They all knew that the thickly polluted air of the type of factory Everett had so casually committed Finley to work in would play havoc on the poor boy's weak lungs. It's a shame you don't have any family living elsewhere who you could go to, Ted mused. Somewhere out in the country is what young Finley needs. A traveler on business from out west came in here the other day and said that the clean, country air had worked like a miracle to make his daughter better. Do you remember Maggie? Where did he say they were living? Maggie cast her mind back, and then her expression brightened. You've just given me a grand idea, Ted. She smacked a kiss on his cheek with a laugh and bustled across the room to a stack of papers on the desk in the corner where she did Ted's books, rifling through them quickly. Here it is, she cried triumphantly. This could be the answer to your prayers, Annie. Don't dismiss it out of hand. Just give it your consideration. She shook the paper open and laid it on the table in front of Annie. It's the Matrimonial Times. Gentlemen out west looking for a bride, with everything on offer. Marriage, a home, and best of all, safely away from Everett. Annie turned her green eyes on Maggie with a look of shock. I'm not marrying a man I've never even met. What if I don't like him? I know it's not ideal, but really, what choice do you have, Annie? You can't risk Finley getting sick, which he will if he goes to work in that dreadful factory. And you don't have the means to move somewhere new and start a job without knowing a soul, especially with Finley to look after as well. Maggie held her gaze and tapped her finger on the paper. These are good men, Annie. Hard-working, God-fearing, decent men. They just don't have the time to go courting, and there aren't enough women out west for them. Take a look. You might just be surprised. Hang on a minute. You sound mighty enthusiastic about these gents, Maggie. Is there something you're not telling me? Ted Roche put an arm around Maggie's waist and hugged her, giving Annie a wink. Don't be a fool, Ted. You know I'll never have eyes for anyone but you. Maggie tapped on the newspaper again, not letting Annie dismiss it without even looking. Annie glanced down reluctantly, feeling her cheeks turning pink at the thought of becoming a wife this way. I thought only desperate women did this sort of thing, she muttered. A small section with a swirling font caught her eye. The Happy Hearts Matrimonial Agency is looking for women who want a fresh start in life in the Blossom Creek district, with only honest, kindly gentlemen on our books. She skimmed the advertisements beneath and felt herself being drawn to one in particular, describing a Mr. Gilligan. It sounded almost too good to be true, and she wondered what the catch was. A gentleman of private means, with a delightful ranch in the clean, fresh mountain air near Blossom Creek, seeks a hard-working woman to be his bride and soulmate as soon as possible. He would like nothing more than to start a family and promises to be a devoted husband. She muttered the words quietly to herself, and a sudden mental image of Finley, bursting with good health and rosy cheeks in a sunlit meadow, made her smile. See, I told you. Maggie said with a big grin, peering over Annie's shoulder at the advertisement. He sounds romantic and practical. A thoroughly good catch for someone as beautiful as you. Let's get you a pen and paper so you can reply right away. This has come as a bit of a surprise. Annie felt a sliver of hope enter her heart at the idea of being able to leave Everett far behind and give Finley a better life. She reread the advertisement and thought back to what she had said to Maggie a few moments earlier about only desperate women using a service like this. But I am a desperate woman. The thought came as a stark realization. She didn't have any money of her own to fall back on or family to go and stay with. It was just her and Finley against the world, and she had promised their ma that she would do whatever it took to look after him. Sending him to work in a stinking factory would be the death of him. She could feel it in her bones. So what other option did she have? Maggie slipped some paper into Annie's bag and passed it to her as they stood up to leave. Right back today, Annie. As sad as it makes us for you to leave New York, it's for the best, and any gentleman out west would be lucky to have you. Don't see it as second best. It's an opportunity to make a new life and be safe. Annie nodded slowly and hugged Maggie. It was the first time she had felt anything other than desolation since they had lost Sylvia, and she wondered what fate might have in store for them. As strange as it might be, the Happy Hearts Agency might turn out to be the escape she was looking for, with marriage to a kind man as an unexpected bonus. She thanked her lucky stars. She'd had the idea to trust in her friends for advice. Now all she had to do was make sure that Everett didn't suspect a thing and hope that the mysterious Mr. Gilligan would like her reply enough to start a correspondence with her. As she and Finley hurried back to their apartment, she started to formulate a reply in her head. Dear Mr. Gilligan, I'm a hard-working young woman, and due to my dear mother passing away recently, I'm looking for a new life and adventure out west with my ailing younger brother. She glanced at Finley, wondering whether she should introduce him in her very first letter. He had dark shadows under his eyes from being with her at the market all day, and there was a worrying rattle with each breath he took that told her he would need to inhale some steam and menthol that night to ease his chest. She thought about the advertisement again. Mr. Gilligan had sounded like a nice enough man, but he wanted a bride and a family of his own. Not a ready-made family of a bride with a brother. She realized this left her with a dilemma. Finley caught her eye and gave her a smile. Do you really think we could go out west, Annie? I read one of Ma's books about it, and it sounds just like our dream life we always talked about. I promise I'll work as hard as I can. Your new husband won't mind me coming too, will he? I don't want to be a burden. Annie tucked Finley's hand in the crook of her arm and gave it a squeeze. He'll be glad to have you, Finley, and don't you dare think otherwise. You'll never be a burden. Ma would be so proud of you trying as hard as you can, even when you feel poorly. I thought for one awful minute there that Maggie meant for you to head out west to marry and leave me behind. Nope, never, Annie replied stoutly. I promised Ma I'd take good care of you, and I'm not about to let her or you down, ever. Their apartment loomed into view, and they quickened their pace. With a bit of luck, Everett would be too busy drinking whiskey to come home until after they were asleep, and she would have time to write her letter ready for sending the following day. As they clambered up the stairs, Annie came to a decision. Mr. Gilligan didn't need to know about Finley, not right at the start. She would tell him once they'd corresponded for a while, and she knew him better. That seemed like the best thing to do all round. She just had to hope that he would understand. Chapter 6. New York. Annie rattled the poker in the fire and added a couple of lumps of coal. The bucket was nearly empty, and she knew she would have to get to market even earlier than usual over the coming days if she wanted to earn enough to try and keep the apartment heated. She sat down, glad to rest her aching feet, and pulled the letter from her apron pocket that she had been saving to read once Finley had gone to bed. Her mouth curved into a smile, and she savored the moment, tilting the sheet of paper toward the light. Over the last few weeks, since Robert Gilligan had replied to her first letter, they had corresponded regularly. She had learned that Pine Tree Ranch had been brought into existence by Robert's hard work, not handed down by his parents like many of them were. He told her that although he had originally thought the ranch was more than enough to fill his days, and his mother, who lived with him, gave him what company and support she could. Lately, he had come to realize that having a wife by his side would make everything more worthwhile. In return, Annie had told him about life in New York. How every day at the market was a battle of wits to secure the best items from the wholesaler. Then an anxious time hoping that there were enough people passing to purchase her wares for a small profit. In her last letter, she had spoken of her own mother too, describing the way that Sylvia had raised her to understand that hard work and a cheerful disposition were the best way to overcome the inevitable challenges that life threw up. Although hesitant to mention Everett at all, she had skirted around the topic, saying only that he was no longer the man Sylvia had married when she'd been widowed, and that his behavior after he'd had too much whiskey had put her in a difficult position. And I still haven't mentioned Finley. She pushed the guilty thought away, telling herself that the time wasn't quite right yet. Annie sighed as her thoughts turned toward the last few evenings. Everett's behavior had gradually become more erratic. She had heard rumors that the manager at the brewery was regretting his decision to keep Everett on, and that he was only hanging on to his job by the skin of his teeth because they were short of workers at the moment. And as for Everett, he seemed to be long past caring. No matter how much he drank, it was never enough, and their money was dwindling at an alarming rate. "Are you all right, Annie?" Her reverie was broken by Finley's shadow in the doorway. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and came and sat next to her in front of the fire. "Can't you sleep?" Annie tousled his hair, not answering his question. "I'm getting worried about starting at the factory next week. What if they don't think I'm working hard enough? I'm scared of what Pa would do if they're not happy with me." His face was creased with worry as he gazed at the flickering flames in the grate. "I hope it won't be for long, Finley. Mr. Gilligan from out west has assured me that he is only corresponding with me, not any other ladies. I asked Maggie about it, and she told me it's a good sign. It shows he's a man of morals and that he might propose marriage sometime soon." Relief washed over Finley's face, and he gave his sister a grin. "I feel better about being at the factory knowing that we'll be in the beautiful countryside soon enough." He stood up and yawned. "Are you sure Pa doesn't suspect anything?" "Nope, so let's make sure we keep it that way." Annie shooed him back to bed and tidied up ready for the morning. She tried to ignore the nagging sense of guilt that she hadn't yet told Robert about her promise to Sylvia to look after Finley, but she knew to her very core that it was a promise she would honor, no matter what desperate events life might throw at her. "I'll put it in my next letter. I'm sure he wouldn't mind anyway, not once he gets to know Finley." The thought that she would come clean about her responsibilities toward her brother comforted her, and she thought nothing more of it as she turned down the oil lamp and climbed into her narrow bed in the opposite corner of the bedroom she shared with Finley. As she watched the pale light from the moon tracking across the wooden floorboards and drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with golden meadows and sunlit mountains, far away from the clutches of her stepfather. "For goodness sake, boy, do you have to make such a racket?" Everett glared at Finley over his cup of coffee the following morning. Sorry, Pa, I can't seem to catch my breath." A fresh bout of coughing shook Finley's shoulders, and his face turned scarlet from the exertion of trying to breathe. "He's not doing it on purpose," Annie snapped. She poured boiling water over some menthol liniment, and Finley bent his head over it to inhale the steam. "He's only been at the factory for a week," Everett said sourly. He slurped his coffee and watched Finley with a resentful expression. "My reputation at the saloon is resting on Finley working hard. You know I owe money from a bad run at the cards. Mr. Sawyer won't consider the debt paid if Finley's off sick every 5 minutes." "Perhaps you should have thought of that before getting into debt in the first place," Annie shot back. She rubbed Finley's back, feeling the crackling in his lungs with each breath he took. "We're running out of money for rent and food, and I told you the smoke and dust at the factory would be a disaster for Finley. but you don't seem to care." Everett's face darkened, and he suddenly brought his fist down on the table with a crash, making them both jump. "That's enough of your insolence, Annie. Finley, get to bed right now, and I'll deal with you later." He jabbed his finger in Annie's arm before snatching up his coat and striding out of the apartment. "I'm sorry, Annie. I try not to cough, but I just can't stop myself." Finley sounded remorseful. "It's not your fault you're ill. If that brute had listened to what I said, none of this would have happened." Annie gave her brother a hug and wrapped an extra blanket over his shoulders as she tucked him up. "Maybe I should have a word with Mr. Sawyer tomorrow after I've finished at the market. I could ask if there are any jobs you could do in the office with the clerks instead." Finley smiled up at her, and Annie felt her chest squeeze with anxiety. Finley's health had deteriorated faster than even she had anticipated it would from breathing in the fumes and dust all day long. But Everett was insistent that Finley should continue working there. She wondered where the last shreds of his decency had gone and shook her head with frustration. There was no point waiting for Everett to change his ways. Things had gone way past that happening, and she had to take matters into her own hands. Once she knew that Finley was asleep, Annie riddled the fire again and sat in the quiet, considering her options. She pulled out Robert's last letter and skimmed it again. Although it was friendly, there was still no word of marriage yet, and she stuffed it back into her pocket with a sigh. She would just have to plead with Mr. Sawyer and hope that she might be able to charm or cajole him to move Finley to a different part of the factory. Her heart felt heavy as she considered her options, and she wished for the 1,000th time that Sylvia was still here to guide her. She had to do whatever it took to keep Finley safe and healthy for a few more months. Winter would be arriving soon, and she figured that once the snow came, Robert would probably want to wait until the spring to ask her to travel west. If he even asks me at all. The unwelcome thought snagged at the edge of Annie's mind as she dozed off next to the fire. "Wake up, Annie. I'm getting tired of waiting. Besides, you owe me." Annie's eyes flew open, and for a moment she wondered if she'd been having a bad dream. She reached for the oil lamp, but just as she went to grasp it, a fist clamped tightly around her wrist, and Everett loomed over her in the darkness. "Get off me." She tried to shake him off, but his grip tightened. "You can't deny me forever, Annie. Besides, you should be flattered. You're a pretty girl, and I'll take good care of you." Everett's voice had a whine to it, and the edges of his words were slurred. "No, Everett, it's not right or decent. You're my stepfather, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Ma would have been horrified to see you behaving like this." Her words seemed to have a sobering effect, and he let go of Annie's wrist, stumbling backward and slumping in the chair opposite her. Annie took advantage of the moment to light the oil lamp, hoping that the brightness would put paid to his advances. "Doesn't matter," Everett mumbled. "It'll just be you and me here next week, and then you won't be able to say no." "What do you mean?" Annie felt a shiver of worry as a sly expression came over Everett's face. "I lost at cards again tonight." Everett's mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "Mr. Sawyer said that the only way to pay my debt off is for Finley to live at the factory for the time being, so he can work longer hours instead of finishing at 5 and coming home every evening." "No." Annie felt the fear curdling in her stomach. She knew that Finley would never survive living away from home, sleeping in some squalid attic room at the factory. They probably would hardly feed him, and he was barely managing with his ill health as it was. "Oh yes, my pretty one. Finley will be gone by this time next week, and you'll start showing me the respect that I deserve." His lustful gaze raked over Annie's shapely figure, and she jumped up, not wanting to be in his company for one moment longer. "It's time to cut your apron strings with Finley and make a man of him, and it's time for you to get over your false sense of modesty and start keeping me warm at night." Annie fled to her room, and Everett's mumbled words felt like shards of ice piercing her heart. The last thing she heard, as she dragged the chest of drawers against the door of her bedroom to keep him out, was his drunken, mocking laughter. Her situation was becoming worse every day, and there was nothing she could do about it. "You must stay here by the fire, Finley. Annie pulled the chair closer to the hearth and tucked the blanket over his knees. His cheeks were flushed, and she didn't like the glassy look in his eyes. He was running a temperature and had hardly slept a wink all night. "But what about the factory? What will Mr. Sawyer say if I don't show up?" "You leave that to me," Annie said firmly. "I'll go there before I start work and explain that you're unwell and keep the door locked. Everett's gone for the day, and hopefully he won't even know you're at home." A few moments later, Annie pulled her collar up and hurried through the streets, heading toward the factory. In the 2 days since Everett's drunken revelation, Annie had managed to keep herself and Finley out of his way, but she knew that time was not on their side. "Hold up, Annie. I've got a letter for you." The postboy hurried after her, waving a letter, and Annie's heart lifted as she saw the familiar writing on the envelope. Even though it wouldn't be the solution to her problems, at least Robert's news from Blossom Creek and the ranch might help her forget about her woes for a few minutes. She stood in the shelter of a doorway and pulled the letter out to read. "My dear Annie, I hope that you are keeping well and that your stepfather is remembering his manners as a good man should. Whiskey can do terrible things to a man's morals, so I hope that he finds God's grace again in time to return to living as a good Christian should. Over our recent letters, I have found myself feeling hopeful for the future in a way I never imagined would be possible. I'd even go so far as to say that I have fallen in love with the thought of you, and I believe I have finally met a woman who understands me. Your words make the sun shine, even on the dullest day, and you bring happiness to my life, even though we've never met. Annie, none of us knows what the future has in store for us. But one thing has become clear to me over recent weeks. I would very much like to share my future with you by my side, and I hope that you might find it in your heart to feel the same way. I know it's a lot for me to ask of you, to travel out west and leave everything behind that is comfortable and familiar to you. It's not something I take lightly, but would you at least consider it? I would like to ask for your hand in marriage and to share my life with you here at Pine Tree Ranch. I don't want to hurry your decision, but I prayed about this, and I believe in my heart that it's the right thing to ask you now, before winter sets in, rather than waiting until spring. I hope you don't think I'm being too forward, and I will understand if you would rather wait a while if you have things to attend to in New York. I'm a patient man, and I'm happy to wait. You will see that I have enclosed enough money to cover your train fare to Blossom Creek in a comfortable carriage, as well as a bit extra to cover sundries and essentials you might need to purchase for your journey. Don't worry about needing different clothes for life in the country. Blossom Creek has everything you might need, and we lead a quiet life here at the ranch. I pray that God will keep you in his care and deliver you safely to me out west. Yours sincerely, Robert Gilligan. Annie felt a tremble of relief ripple through her as the fear she had been holding tightly within her body melted like a seed floating away on the wind. Suddenly, her bleak future held happiness and hope. Robert's letter of proposal couldn't have come at a better time because she knew that she only had a matter of days before Everett would implement his evil plan to get Finley out of the house and to force her to comply with his dreadful desires. She let out a shaky breath and ran toward the railroad office. If she were quick, she would be able to book 2 tickets for the first train leaving for Blossom Creek, and then send a message to Robert about her arrival by return of post. There was no time to waste. "Is this everything you want to say?" The clerk behind the counter composed Annie's brief telegraph message with a disinterested stare. Yes! Just confirmation that I'm coming and the date the train arrives there, please." Annie counted out her coins carefully, hoping there would be enough. Even though Robert had kindly thought of her comfort and wanted her to travel in one of the nicer carriages, by booking the cheapest seats, she had been able to stretch the money to pay for 2 seats. One for herself and one for Finley. As she hurried home to tell Finley and gather their belongings, she felt another wave of guilt crash over her. Everything had happened so fast that she hadn't had the opportunity to explain that Finley would be coming as well. Her plan to tell Robert about him gradually and explain what a kind, hard-working boy he was over the next few letters, had been swept away by the urgency to get away without Everett finding out. She only hoped that once she had a chance to explain it all to Robert in person when they arrived, he would find it in his heart to understand why she had done it this way. What if he doesn't understand, though? The question plucked at her good conscience as she folded as many of their clothes as would fit into their 2 carpet bags. She rummaged through the drawer where she had hidden her most treasured possessions that had belonged to her mother to prevent Everett from selling them to buy whiskey. There wasn't much. A well-thumbed Bible bound in velvety soft leather, a hairbrush, some hair ribbons, and the locket that their real father had given Sylvia when Annie had been born. Annie fastened the locket around her neck and tucked it into her dress so it couldn't be seen. She traced her fingers over the Bible and looked at herself in the mirror, seeing the guilt and hope mingled together in her reflection. Lord, please keep me and Finley safe on this journey and grant us the chance of a new life with a good man. And please give Robert the grace to understand why I didn't tell him about Finley and the open heart to see the goodness in Finley that I see every day. She closed her eyes and took a shaky breath before adding one final whisper. Please forgive me for leaving without telling Everett where we're going, and give him the strength to put the whiskey and gambling behind him so that he may live in your blessed mercy again, Lord. She glanced around the room one last time, realizing that the last memories of Sylvia's presence had gone now like mist vanishing in the morning sun. All that remained was a few sticks of furniture and the sense of fear every time she heard footsteps approaching outside their apartment. It was time for a new chapter in her life, and she was determined to make it work. Chapter 7. Annie rubbed the sleep from her eyes and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her limbs ached from the hard wooden seats in the third-class carriage she and Finley were in, and she wriggled slightly to try and get some warmth back in her feet. Finley's head lolled forward, and she leaned him gently against the back of the seat, not wanting to wake him. His cheeks were stained with 2 bright spots of red, and she could see a light sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. He looks like he's coming down with something. The elderly woman sitting opposite them reached into the bag she had perched on her knees and passed Annie an orange with a kindly smile. Give him that when he wakes up. Looks like he needs it more than I do, and I'm getting off at the next stop anyway. Thank you, ma'am. That's so kind of you. Annie pocketed the orange and watched Finley struggling for breath next to her. The conductor had told her it was only a couple more hours until they reached Blossom Creek, much to her relief. Finley needed to be out of the cramped conditions of the carriage and allowed to rest somewhere quiet before he got any worse. Look after yourself. The woman patted Annie's shoulder as she gathered her meager belongings. The train was coming to a stop at an outpost that seemed to be little more than one dusty street. You'll like Blossom Creek, the woman added. It's a fine place to marry and raise a family. That clean mountain air will help your brother get better. Just you wait and see. As the train pulled away again a few moments later, Annie felt a pang of regret as she watched the woman being helped into a waiting wagon by what looked to be her son. It had been nice to have a friend to confide in over the last few days of the long journey. The woman had been chatty without prying, and Annie felt comforted by the matter-of-fact way she had spoken about the number of women who came out west to be mail-order brides. It seemed to be quite the normal thing to do in these parts, even though Annie still felt a wave of trepidation about marrying a man she'd never met. She thought back to what the woman had said when Annie had whispered that she was going to be married very soon. Trust that the Lord knows what's best for you, dear, and you won't go far wrong. If you prayed on this, and you've come into it with an honest heart, He'll surely give you the happiness you deserve since your ma passed. The woman had given her a shrewd look, and for a moment Annie had felt as though she could see right into her mind. Some ladies come out west to get away from difficult situations. Seems to me that taking care of your brother might be just such a reason if my intuition serves me right. Annie had nodded, remembering Everett's grip on her wrist and the lustful way he had looked at her, and the disregard he had shown for Finley to wriggle out of his debts. My advice is that secrets in a marriage are like the rot that starts at the center of an apple. It might look rosy on the outside, but it'll poison everything in the end. Be honest with your new husband, dear. You'll be surprised what a man will take account of, as long as he knows your heart is true. The woman had smiled at Annie as she delivered her wisdom, and Annie in a way that reminded her of her mother. She tucked the words away into her mind, feeling more courageous. Annie let the rumbling of the carriage soothe her worries and allowed herself to doze as the last few miles of her journey slipped by. It was hard to believe that she would never see New York or Everett again. She had pushed the drawers against the bedroom door on her last night in the apartment to make sure he couldn't come in, and slept fitfully, feeling in turn both hopeful for a better future and terrified that some last-minute complication might snatch the opportunity from her. As it turned out, Everett had snored loudly on the couch all night and then left for work early the following morning. Annie had swiftly penned a letter to him, which she left propped against the jug in the center of the table. She wished him well for the future and explained that she and Finley were starting a new life far away to give Finley the chance of better health. She thought back to how she had struggled to know how to finish the letter. Everett hadn't always been a horrible man, and she felt a pang of guilt that he would be all alone. In the end, she had hastily added that there was no point in his coming to look for them, and she hoped that he found God's grace to live a happier life. They had hurried to the station, stopping only at the Roche's shop to wish their dear friends goodbye. Maggie had given them both a huge hug, wiping the tears from her eyes. "Sylvia would have wanted you to do this, Annie," she had whispered as they hugged. "Safe travels, and I hope Robert and Blossom Creek are everything you wish for." Blossom Creek up ahead! The conductor pushed his way through the crowded aisle of their carriage, shouting over the cacophony of noise to announce the next stop. "Is this it, Annie? Are we really here?" Finley looked dazed as he blinked awake. "We sure are, honey. Not much longer until we'll have you safe and sound at the ranch, I'm sure." Annie felt a shiver of nerves as the town gradually came into view. Suddenly, the connection she had felt with Robert through their letters felt gossamer thin, and for a moment, she wished she'd met a nice young man in New York to get married the usual way, instead of risking everything on a stranger. "I know I'll perk up just as soon as this nasty cough gets better. I won't be a burden, Annie, I promise." Finley gave her a grin, and she was glad to see the listless look had gone from his eyes. "Look at the snow on the mountains." He pressed his face to the window, marveling at how different the landscape looked from when he had fallen asleep. Back then, it had been flat and brown, but here on the outskirts of Blossom Creek, the trees were bedecked in jewel-colored leaves that shimmered in the fall breeze, and the clear blue sky stretched as far as the eye could see. Annie started to feel excitement and trepidation bubbling up inside of her. The quaint clapboard houses at the edge of town were surrounded by well-tended gardens that were going past their summer glory, but still looked astonishingly homely and beautiful after the grime and overcrowding of the district in New York, where they had grown up. As they pulled closer to the station, she could see mercantile stores, saloons, and bustling streets. Robert had told her that Blossom Creek was a fast-growing town that served a sizable area, and she could see that he had been right. There was a hive of activity wherever she looked, and her first impression was that everyone seemed so much happier than in New York. They stopped to chat, and the wholesome scene filled her with sudden reassurance that she had done the right thing after all. "I think we'll be so happy here, Annie, and I know Robert will think he's struck gold when he finds out how lovely you really are." Finley's eyes sparkled with anticipation, and Annie felt humbled by his kind words. Her little brother might never grow up to be a strong, strapping young man, but his good heart would make some young lady very happy one day in the future, Annie thought to herself with quiet gratitude. "This way, ma'am." The conductor handed Annie her carpet bag and ushered them down the aisle and off the train. There was a hum of busyness as people dashed to and fro, with shouts as family and friends greeted each other. Horses whinnied from where they were tied up outside the station office, and porters struggled past, unloading trunks for weary travelers and boxes of goods for local businesses. Annie craned her neck, suddenly noticing that Finley had gotten separated from her. She could see his tousled hair some way behind her, and she gripped her bag tighter, deciding to wait for him to catch up. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you Miss Doyle?" A warm, deep voice inquired. Annie turned just as someone jostled past and found herself facing a solid chest clad in a worn buckskin coat. She tilted her head and was met with a pair of brown eyes the color of molasses. The man's broad shoulders were like a rock in the river, protecting her from further jostling by the crowds, and his dark hair curled at his collar. "Robert Gilligan, ma'am, pleased to meet you." His mouth curved into a smile, and he took her hand in a firm grip, shaking it as if they were at a formal meeting. "Ah, Annie? Yes, I'm Annie Doyle." Annie smiled up at him, feeling a rush of mixed emotions. Relief that he was here to meet her, panic that they were finally face to face, and she paused to consider the fact that her heart was beating faster than usual. Yes, definitely attraction. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Gilligan." My, that's a classy reply," he said, holding her hand for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. "I'm not sure I've ever been greeted that respectfully before," he added with a self-deprecating chuckle. "You got my telegraph then?" Annie said, suddenly feeling shy. "I was worried you might not be here on time, what with me coming out west so quickly. My neighbor rushed it out to me, and I came straight into town. It would have been mighty rude not to be here, and my ma would have been most upset if a beauty like you had caught someone else's eye. You can't be too careful around here with so many single men looking for a wife." "Well, it's very kind of you to meet me on time. I appreciate your thoughtfulness," Annie replied, not knowing how to thank him for the backhanded compliment or whether he was teasing. "I know you might have been thinking we'd be married straight away. That's what a lot of folks do. But the pastor is away today with a funeral to minister to." He saw a shadow of alarm on Annie's face and hastened to reassure her. "Ma lives at home with me, and you'll have your own room at the ranch, of course, so there won't be any harm to your reputation. Ma has agreed to be a chaperone." He twisted his hat in his hands and gave her a hesitant smile. "I thought you might like for us to get to know each other a bit more before we get wed, too. It's kinda unusual to marry someone straight away without meeting them in person. Although my intentions are honorable, I give you my word," he added hastily. Annie bit back a smile. She could tell that underneath his rugged exterior, he felt as nervous as she did. "I think that's very sensible, Mr. Gilligan," she agreed. Now she would have a chance to properly introduce Finley and not feel so bad about her small deception. "Call me Robert, please. We don't stand on ceremony in these parts. Let's get going, then. We've still got a fair drive to get back to the ranch." He grasped her carpetbag as if it weighed nothing, and Annie's heart fluttered faster again at the display of his strength. He took her elbow with his spare hand and pulled her closer to steer her toward his wagon. As the number of people around them started to thin, he gradually became aware of a figure standing nearby, watching them. "Can I help you, son?" He shot the boy an inquiring smile and found himself looking at the same green eyes and copper hair that Annie had. "I'm Finley Doyle, sir. It's very nice to meet you." Finley flushed as he stepped forward to shake Robert's hand. He darted a glance at Annie, looking for her reassurance that he was doing the right thing. "Huh? What do you mean you're—" "Robert, I didn't have a chance to tell you because we came out to Blossom Creek so much faster than I thought we would." Annie's words came out in a breathless rush. "This is my younger brother, Finley. I promised my ma on her deathbed that I would always look after him. So, he's here with me. We're together, you see." Chapter 8. Blossom Creek, Montana. "Here we are, then." Robert gestured to the winding track that snaked into the distance. "Pine Tree Ranch." He shot a glance at Annie, taking in the slight tilt of her nose and the way her coppery-colored curls glinted in the low sunlight. His heart thumped in his chest as she turned to smile at him. She was quite the most attractive woman he had ever seen, even though he could see she wasn't what some would call a classic beauty. The freckles across her cheeks and the determined set of her chin meant that some men would have passed her by for someone more dainty. But he liked the way her green eyes showed her emotions, like reflections on a pool of water, and the blemishes on her hands that spoke of her not being afraid of hard work. Annie put her arm around Finley's shoulders and tucked the rug more firmly across his knees. Robert could see how much she loved the boy, and he wanted to admire her for that too. But instead, he focused on guiding the horse through the entrance and over the rough ruts that had been gouged out of the ground during the last storm. Finley Doyle. The unexpected dilemma on what should have been a perfect day, Robert thought with a dart of confusion. He knew that he should have been more welcoming once he'd gotten over his initial surprise, but instead he had been terse with his conversation on the wagon journey from Blossom Creek to his ranch, unable to help himself. Seeing Finley's skinny shoulders and pale complexion had shocked him to the core because he reminded Robert so much of someone he had tried very hard to forget. Even worse, Finley's guileless expression and the way he had tried so hard not to look hurt by Robert's lackluster welcome made Robert feel even more ashamed of his instinctive rejection of the boy. As they rounded the corner and the homestead came into view, a woman bustled out onto the front porch and lifted her hand to wave at them. "Welcome, welcome." The woman hurried toward the wagon as Robert pulled them to a halt in front of the barn and jumped down to unhitch the horse. "You must be Annie, and who's this fine-looking boy with you? You must both be weary from the journey. Let me get you inside, and you can come and warm up by the fire." "Ma, don't overwhelm them." Robert gave his mother a fond smile, which she returned. "Take no notice, Annie. Since when has a warm welcome been overwhelming? I think Robert is forgetting his manners, what with being nervous about meeting you." She linked arms with Finley and gestured for Annie to follow them up the steps. "This is lovely, Mrs. Gilligan. You've made it so homey and cozy." From the outside, Annie had thought the house quite plain and small, but inside she saw that it was bigger than first impressions gave. The living area had rag rugs on the floor and several comfortable couches next to the fire, and off to one side, there was a roomy kitchen with a large stove, a dresser laden with mismatched crockery, and a large scrubbed wooden table and chairs. On the other side of the living area was a small hallway, with what she assumed to be bedrooms leading off it. Although the furniture had seen better days, there were homely touches in every corner. A vase of late flowers and berries on the dresser, colorful cushions on the couches, and several intricately embroidered samplers hanging on the walls. A small dog jumped up from where he had been dozing in front of the fire and ran up to Finley, wagging his tail ecstatically. "I guess we should introduce ourselves properly. I'm Robert's mother, Nora, and this is Ted, our pup. He's meant to be out in the barn catching rats, but between you and me, I enjoy having his company in the house when I'm alone." Nora swept Annie into a hug, then pulled back, holding each of her arms and giving her a huge smile. "I can't tell you how pleased I am that Robert wrote to you. It gets lonesome for a man out here at the ranch with just his old ma for company." "Thank you, Mrs. Gilligan. You're very kind." Annie blushed, not expecting such an effusive welcome after Robert's chilly demeanor on the drive here. "Call me Nora, please. We're almost family now, and we don't stand on ceremony around these parts. And this must be your brother. He has the exact same eyes as you. What's your name?" Nora turned her gaze toward Finley, laughing as Ted jumped up into Finley's arms with an excited bark. "Ted's very choosy who he makes friends with, and I reckon you've got a friend for life there." "I'm Finley, ma'am. I know I don't look very strong, but I promise I'll work hard and help you and Mr. Gilligan with whatever I can." Finley was suddenly seized with a fit of coughing, and Nora rushed forward to help him onto the couch. She rested the back of her hand on Finley's forehead and gave Annie a worried look. "I think we need to get young Finley into bed with one of my herbal tonics. Has he been like this for long?" She helped him out of his coat and bustled into the kitchen to boil some water. "I'm sorry to cause problems within a few minutes of arriving. We came out west so quickly that I didn't have time to tell Robert that Finley would be coming with me." Annie's cheeks flushed at her deceit, but Nora waved her concerns away. I can see how Robert might have had a bit of a surprise, but that doesn't matter right now. We need to sort Finley out before it gets any worse. I've seen how fast a child can deteriorate with a cough that rattles on the lungs like that from when my... Her words trailed off, and she busied herself in the kitchen, making Annie wonder what she had been about to say. Finley was born a bit early, my ma told me. He's always been prone to coughs and colds in the winter, and I think, a situation he was in back in New York recently made it a bit worse this time. Annie fumbled through her words, not daring to tell Nora the full circumstances of Finley's poor health. She had already warmed to Robert's kindly mother, and the last thing she wanted was for her to think that Annie had come here just for selfish reasons, instead of wanting to be with her son. A shadow fell over them as Robert appeared in the doorway. I've put your bags in your room. We don't have too much space, so I'm afraid that, although you have a room of your own, Finley will have to share with you for now. Annie felt her heart flutter again in a way she'd never experienced before, at how his presence filled the room with powerful masculinity. I figured the boy wasn't too well from the way he was coughing, he added. His expression was hard to read, but Annie took heart that at least he didn't sound angry. It's just separate rooms until the wedding, of course, Nora said, ushering them down the hallway. Robert can set up a separate bed for Finley tomorrow. There's plenty of space for you both. Now, why don't you take a relaxing bath while I help Finley settle in? I've made a nice hot stew for supper, and Finley can have his in bed with some of my herbal tonic. He'll sleep better than he ever has, I guarantee it. And don't you worry, dear, being at Pine Tree Ranch will help him get well. Just you wait and see. Annie swallowed back her tears as she took her time soaking in the bath, washing the grime of the journey away. Nora's kindness had made her miss her own mother more than ever and realized just how worried she had been about Finley's well-being. It felt good to have someone looking out for them again, and she hoped that Robert would warm to Finley's presence as much as Nora clearly had. The homey sound of quiet talking met Annie's ears as she slid into the kitchen after making sure that Finley was all right. She had put on her best dress, wanting to make a good impression, and her heart lifted as she saw the cozy scene. Nora had laid out 3 places at the kitchen table, and Robert sat in the comfortable chair in the corner, quietly whittling a piece of wood as the conversation drifted between them. It was so different from the tense evenings she had spent praying that Everett wouldn't spiral into a drunken rage that she felt a wave of relief wash through her. Spotting someone to make a fuss of him, Ted bounded over to Annie, drawing Robert's gaze in her direction. Annie, come, sit down. You look, that dress looks very fetching on you. Nora chuckled as she saw Robert's cheeks flush. He's not usually so tongue-tied. She gestured for Annie to sit at the table. We're more used to speaking to animals out here than paying compliments to guests, especially when they're as pretty as you. And he's right, that green dress looks mighty pretty on you. It was Annie's turn to feel tongue-tied. What can I do to help? She said hastily, not quite meeting Robert's eye. Don't you worry about that tonight. Nora brought the bowl of stew to the table, and Annie realized how hungry she was as the rich aroma filled the room. Help yourself, and you can serve Robert too if you like. We'll talk about chores tomorrow, once you've had a good night's sleep. Annie ladled the stew into the 3 bowls and passed the bread to Robert with a shy smile. It's so quiet here after New York. It might take a few nights to get used to it. Back home, it was never really quiet, even in the middle of the night, with carriages rumbling past and people heading to work at all hours. The next hour passed pleasantly as Nora asked more about life in New York, and in return, started to tell Annie about ranch life. You'll find it's important to get involved as much as possible, she advised as she cleared away the plates. The winters can feel long, but when you're happy with life, it's not so tough. Besides, I hope the Lord will bless you with children of your own sometime, she finished with a chuckle. It's a fine place to raise a family here, out of harm's way. A shadow passed across her face, and Annie wondered why it looked like grief. Annie and Robert both blushed at the same time at the mention of children before catching each other's eye. A spark of something passed between them, and Annie felt a shiver of attraction run down her back. In the lamplight, now that Robert had taken his coat off, she could see that he had scars all over his hands and forearms, and she wondered how he had gotten them. He didn't seem like a violent man, and ranching was a physical job, but the way he unconsciously touched the scars when he was thinking made her think there was more to it. "I hope you don't find it too hard to settle into our way of life," Robert said quietly, giving her an earnest look. His mouth started to lift in a slow smile. But then he heard Finley coughing, and Annie saw his expression shut down again, as though there was something he didn't want her to know. As the clock ticked quietly on the mantel shelf, Ted suddenly darted at the door, barking ferociously. "Don't mind him. It's probably bears he can hear." Robert stood up and shrugged his coat back on, reaching for a rifle that had been propped up in the corner of the room. He peered out into the darkness, tilting his head to listen, and a sharp wind sent a shower of sparks up the chimney. "Reckon we're in for a change in the weather," Nora said, glancing through the window at the darkness beyond. "It's early for proper snow, but you never know. One year we had snowdrifts almost as high as my waist for weeks." Annie shivered and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She was used to snow in New York, but even when the city had been blanketed with it, life had carried on as normal. Now, she was in the middle of nowhere, living with a man who seemed to have something to hide. The thought of being cut off from Blossom Creek for weeks on end made her suddenly yearn for the familiarity of her old apartment. Even though she had felt scared of Everett, she knew who she was in New York. Here, everything felt strange and new, and she felt like a fish out of water. "Don't worry, Annie. Robert will open up and tell you more about himself when the time is right and he feels ready." The light dimmed as another gust of wind roared down the chimney, and the oil lamps guttered. Nora patted her hand and gave her a kind smile. "Robert's a good man if you give him a chance. I just think Finley being here has stirred up some memories from the past that he'd rather forget," she added cryptically. Chapter 9. Annie swung the door open and peered out in the slate-gray light of dawn. The dark clouds pressed down, threatening more snow, and she felt her lungs catch as she took in a deep breath of the frigid air. The undulating ground was blanketed in a thick layer of snow as far as the eye could see, and there was an eerie silence in the air, as though the land was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She had been at Pine Tree Ranch for 3 weeks now, yet it felt longer. Life was so different here that New York already seemed like a far-off dream. Nightmare, more like, she muttered to herself with a rueful smile. She realized with a start that she didn't miss the grimy streets and daily struggle to put food on the table one little bit. Robert might not have given her the warmest of welcomes, but at least she didn't have to worry about Finley going hungry the way that Nora was feeding him up. "Morning, Annie. Are you getting wood for the fire?" Nora's cheery greeting interrupted her thoughts, and she slipped her feet into her boots, ready to go out to the wood store. "I sure am, Nora. I'll be back just as soon as I've checked on Robert." She walked gingerly down the steps, avoiding the iciest patches, and hurried across the yard toward the barn. Her footsteps from the day before had been covered by another fresh layer of snow that creaked under her feet with each step she took. The stand of pine trees at the bottom of the mountain stood like sentinels guarding the ranch, and every so often there was a cracking, whooshing sound as a branch snapped under the weight of the snow, sending it cascading onto the ground beneath. "How's she doing?" Annie's breath plumed in front of her face as she called to Robert. He lifted his head from where he was tending to the cow he had dug out of a snowdrift a few days earlier and felt his spirits rise at the sound of company. Annie edged through the heavy barn door, and her nostrils twitched with pleasure at the smell of the fragrant summer hay that the cows were munching on. "I reckon we rescued her just in the nick of time." Robert stroked the cow's neck as she struggled to her feet. She stood there, getting her bearings, then sniffed at the tuft of hay that Robert held out to her, walking forward on shaky legs. One more night, and she'd have been a goner. Annie let out the breath she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. Each cow was worth a lot of money to the ranch, and to lose a fit, healthy animal like her would have been a blow to their finances. But worse still, it would have hit Robert hard. Although country life was all new to her, she could see how much he loved his livestock by the fact that he had risked his life in the snowstorm to rescue her. "I'm making eggs for breakfast. Shall I do some for you?" Annie shot him a smile, pleased to see the worry had eased in his eyes. "I've got to check on the cattle in the far paddock." Robert rubbed the muscles in his neck, trying to ease the knot from where he'd slept awkwardly, dozing in the straw as he'd kept watch on the cow. "Would you like me to help you?" Annie tried again. "I could pack some cornbread for you to take, and ride with you to keep you company. You've hardly eaten a thing in the last few days. Maybe I could brew a pot of coffee, and you could have a hot drink before you go, at least." She was babbling, she knew, but she couldn't help herself. Robert's demeanor seemed as mercurial as the weather, warm one day, then as cold as the snow outside the next, and she had no idea what she had done wrong. "Nope, you'd be more of a help than a hindrance in this sort of weather. I'll get it done faster on my own." He wished he could have taken back the words as soon as he saw the hurt of his rejection cloud her face. "What I mean is, you're needed in the house to look after Finley. What if he gets worse? You'd never forgive yourself if you didn't know you'd done your very best to help him recover, would you?" Annie stumbled back at the force of his words, feeling almost as though he had struck her. "I'm just trying to help," she retorted. Her green eyes flashed with a sudden spark of anger. "I'd never do anything but my very best for Finley, Robert. I promised Ma on her deathbed that I would look after him, and I will." She sighed, her anger dissipating as quickly as it had arrived. "I'm just trying to find my place at the ranch, is all." Robert stepped forward and brushed his hand on her arm. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean anything by what I said. I guess I'm just tired and cranky, and not thinking before I speak, as usual. Ma says I get like this every winter." The Cupid's bow of her lips as she gave him a hesitant smile caught his gaze, and he wondered what it would feel like to kiss her, before quickly putting the thought out of his mind. "You're a devoted sister, and Finley is lucky to have you." He looked into her green eyes and saw that his apology had been accepted, even though Annie stepped back and crossed her arms, putting a barrier between them. "You're right, anyway," she said brightly with a shrug. "I'm not much good on a horse yet, but I promise I'll learn to ride better just as soon as the snow melts, and you've got time to teach me." She picked her basket up and turned on her heel. "Finley wanted me to tell you that he's read all the books you gave him about looking after cattle, and he can't wait to help you with some chores of his own." With that, she marched out of the barn and back across the snow. "It's no good. He's wishing I never came, and he'll never learn to accept Finley, let alone love him as family." The thought struck her as hard as the icy wind, and she blinked back the tears that prickled at the back of her eyes. As she piled the logs into her basket, Annie's mind whirled. Robert seemed like an enigma to her. Even after 3 weeks under the same roof, she often found herself struggling to fathom what he was thinking. All she knew was that every time it felt as though he was starting to get closer to her, taking an interest in what she said or seeking out her company, the next minute he pulled back again, becoming distant and barely saying a word for days at a time. "Come on, Ted. Let's get back in the warm again." The dog snuffled around her feet and bounded ahead, flicking up piles of snow with his nose. "Maybe Nora can shed some light on things," she muttered to herself, vowing to ask her as soon as the right moment came. Robert stood in the doorway of the barn, concealed in the shadows, and watched Annie lugging the basket of logs onto her hip and struggling back through the snow. Every sinew of him wanted to race after her and relieve her of the heavy basket before pulling her into his embrace. "Don't be such a fool, Robert. Why would she want that when you've just upset her again?" He scolded himself out loud with a heavy sigh and turned back into the barn to saddle his horse for the long day ahead. The cow lowed gently, and he leaned on the gate of her stall to watch her eat, pleased to see that she was looking brighter already. Her brown eyes watched him with a steady bovine gaze as she rhythmically chewed the hay. "I know," I know. Robert grimaced and put his hands up in defeat. I'm making about as big a mess of this as a man could possibly make. No wonder Annie looks like she's thinking about taking the first train back to New York when I make her feel so unwelcome. He shook his head and sighed again as the cow turned away to drink some water. As he led his horse out of the stable and swung himself into the saddle with practiced ease, he saw a face pressed at the window of the house watching him. It was Finley, and the boy gave him a cheerful wave before Annie pulled him away to tuck him under the warmth of the blankets again. Robert gave the boy a curt nod, feeling a worm of shame in his belly as he saw Finley's face fall with disappointment. He picked his reins up and clicked his tongue, telling the horse to walk on. Tell me, Lord, what can I do to make this better? It's not that I don't love her. Far from it. But I'm afraid. What if I make the same mistakes again? How would I ever forgive myself? Robert whispered the prayer under his breath, and as he glanced back at the house one last time, he saw Annie framed in the window looking at him. She had one hand pressed against the glass as though she wanted to reach out to him, but didn't know how, and her face was filled with longing and confusion. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks harder than he'd intended, and the snow flew up from her hooves as she loped down the hill toward the horizon. For one brief moment, the clouds parted, and the sun glistened off the snow, like 1,000 tiny rainbows, making Robert gasp with surprise. It was as if God had heard his plea and wanted to send him a sign. He pulled the mare to a sudden halt and laughed out loud. "Thank you, Lord," he cried. "I'll tell her everything, I promise." His shout echoed off the side of the mountain, sending a flock of birds skittering into the sky, and for the first time since Annie had arrived, Robert knew he had been just as guilty as her of not being entirely honest in the seeds of their new relationship. He galloped onwards, knowing that it was high time he put it right. Chapter 10. I don't like the look of this weather one little bit. Nora turned from the window and tutted to herself. Isn't it a good thing that it's warm again? Annie leaned toward the lamplight to thread the needle and resumed hemming the long skirt that pooled on her lap. You'd think so. Nora harumphed and started scrubbing the dishes with renewed vigor. Trouble is, when it's cold one minute and warm the next, that's when the animals are more likely to get sick. She glanced up at the sound of a coughing fit coming from Finley's bedroom. People too, she added with a worried frown. Outside, the melting snow gurgled as it ran in rivulets off the homestead roof, and the fire hissed as water droplets fell down the chimney and hit the flames. After 3 weeks of being snowed in, the wind had suddenly changed direction, bringing an unexpected thaw, leaving Robert and Nora perplexed at the unusual weather. I keep praying for him, and I know your remedies are helping, Nora, but I've got to admit, I'm worried about Finley. He's never been this sick before. If it hadn't been for that dreadful factory. Annie bit her words back, not wanting to talk about the past. Maybe we could pray together, Nora said softly. I reckon the poor boy is still exhausted from the journey, and as I said, this weather doesn't know whether it's coming or going. I'd like that, please. It would be very comforting. Annie put her mending to one side as Nora sat next to her in front of the fire. Annie reached for Nora's hand and closed her eyes, hoping that she would find the right words. Dear Lord, please protect Finley and keep him safe in your love and healing. Do not let the bad air of New York linger in his lungs and steal his chance for a recovery now that we have come somewhere as beautiful as Pine Tree Ranch. Dear Lord, please give Finley the new start we would like to have with Nora and Robert. Let us experience the glory of everything you have created at Blossom Creek with this good family and their animals. Please give Finley renewed strength and hold him in your righteous hand, that we may do good in your name. We ask this not because we deserve or expect your healing, Lord, but because your graciousness and love transcend our human frailties, and we submit to your higher power. Amen. Nora dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief and gave Annie's hand a squeeze. That was beautiful, and I'm so glad that you and Finley are people of faith. I just hope the Lord is listening, Nora. I've not always made choices he might have approved of. The Lord will be the judge of that, not us. Nora replied crisply. We are all sinners in his eyes, but he gives us the path to salvation if we choose to see his grace. Annie resumed her stitching and couldn't help but agree with what Nora had just said. She wasn't sure whether Finley would be able to shake off this illness that had him in its grip, or whether Robert would ever truly warm to them in the way that she longed for. But all she could do was trust in the Lord and try to do her best for the people who depended on her. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, and Annie bustled through to watch Finley every half hour or so, getting more concerned with each visit. "How's he doing?" Darkness had fallen, and Robert had finished tending to the animals. He stood in the bedroom doorway and saw the deep lines of worry and tiredness etched on Annie's face. "This illness is just not shifting." Annie pressed her hand to Finley's forehead and recognized the hot, dry feel of his skin. It was the same way Sylvia had felt in the days leading up to her passing away. "How do we get hold of a doctor out here at the ranch, Robert?" "I don't want to speak out of turn, but I don't think Nora's remedies are enough any longer. I can't just sit here and watch Finley struggle." Robert's heart squeezed as he heard the anguish in Annie's plea. "The only way to get a doctor is for me to ride to Blossom Creek." "You can't go in the dark, though," Annie shot back. "Even I can tell that it would be a disaster waiting to happen if you tried to make your way through all that mud and melting snow. The ground looks treacherous even walking between here and the barns." "You're right, but I can go first thing in the morning," Robert reassured her. Annie's lip trembled as she bit back her fear, and she nodded slowly. "Would you do that for us?" "Of course, I promise. I'll stay up with you and leave the minute it's safe." He stepped into the room and lifted the shawl from Annie's bed, placing it gently over her shoulders, letting his hand rest there for a moment. He couldn't say how much he cared for her with his words yet, but he hoped his actions would convey a little of his feelings. The long hours stretched out as Annie dozed in the chair next to Finley. Her mind drifted back over her life in New York, and she purposely tried to focus only on the happy times. She remembered Finley and her scuffing through crisp red leaves in the park during fall, laughing with their mother several Christmases ago when she had surprised them with gingerbread men, taking a picnic to the river one summer long ago on a rare day off when the sun had bathed the city in golden light, and Finley had learned how to skim pebbles on the sparkling water. "Annie, am I going to die?" Finley's thready whisper snapped Annie out of her half-sleep state, and she jumped up from her chair, hurrying to his side. The inky darkness of the sky outside had started to leach to a paler gray color. "Sorry, Finley, I didn't mean to drift off to sleep." Annie perched on the edge of his bed and gently wiped his brow with a damp cloth infused with Nora's health-giving herbal mix. She turned the lamp up slightly, and her mouth curved into a sudden smile at what she saw. "Quite the opposite. I think you've turned a corner, Finley, praise the Lord." Her brother blinked up at her with brighter eyes than he'd had in days and gave her a tremulous smile back. "I heard Robert praying by my bedside when you went to fetch more water. At least I think I did. I can't tell what's a dream and what's real. He spoke of someone called Ryan, so maybe it was a dream?" Annie shook her head, puzzled. "I've never heard any mention of anyone called Ryan. All I know is that I like the sound of Robert's voice." Finley continued. "I like him a lot, Annie. I'm glad we're here. As soon as I get better, do you think Robert would teach me to ride? I want to help him on the ranch and do my best to make you proud of me." "I'm proud of you anyway," Annie chuckled. "You've got a way to go before you'll be working outside. How about you start by having a nice, refreshing sleep until daybreak, huh? You've given me quite a scare with this fever, and I want to make sure you don't do too much too soon." She ruffled his hair and turned the lamp down again, pleased to see that he was already drifting off to sleep again. "Come sit by the fire with me." Annie jumped as she heard Robert's quiet invitation from the doorway. "It looks to me like his fever has broken, and now it's just a matter of rest and good food until he's back on his feet again. Ma will make sure he gets plenty of that. Trust me." Annie followed Robert, and he gestured to the comfortable chair he had pulled next to the fire for her. "Thank you. I can rest easy now that I know he's on the mend." She smiled gratefully as he placed 2 freshly brewed cups of coffee on the small table, and the air filled with the rich aroma of it. "There's something I need to tell you, and you might not like it." Annie sipped her coffee and felt a tremor deep inside her. The firelight made the room feel cozy and intimate, but Robert's expression was serious and his dark eyes were hard to read. She took a shaky breath, and her imagination ran wild as he paused to find the right words. "He's going to tell me I have to leave. I knew the chance of a new life was too good to be true. My deception about Finley has made him realize he can't marry me." Her mind raced with the hammer blow that was about to fall, and she felt her stomach clench at the thought of having to return to the dreary apartment back in New York and the delight that Everett would take in her failure. "You might have noticed that I've been a bit distant, unwelcoming to Finley." Robert felt his way through what he wanted to say, desperate not to say the wrong thing. He saw Annie drop her gaze and plowed on before he lost his nerve. "It's not the fact that you didn't tell me he was coming to Blossom Creek with you." "Are you sure? I could tell it was a shock." "The thing is," Robert continued as though she hadn't spoken, "when I saw Finley, it was a shock, but not because he was there. It was a shock because he reminded me so much of my younger brother Ryan." Annie's mouth gaped open, and she took another sip of coffee to hide her surprise. Nobody had mentioned a younger brother called Ryan, and she wondered where he was. The place where we lived before coming here was another frontier town. It was rough and lawless. Ryan was a frail boy, much like Finley, and he fell in with the wrong crowd. Ma always said that he was easily led because he wanted to fit in with the other boys. Some of them took advantage of his kindly nature. Robert's face darkened as the memories drew him back into the past. "So where is he now?" Annie asked gently. She had visions of him being in prison or turning up on the doorstep like a bad penny. "What you need to understand is that we were very poor, Annie. My pa died when Ryan was only a few years old, and Ma struggled to keep us fed and clothed. I was a strapping 18-year-old, and I was determined to help Ma however I could. A man came to town one day and saw me working at the lumber yard. He said I could earn good money as a bare-knuckle fighter." "Fighting? For money?" The words were out before Annie could stop them, and she saw the shame flood Robert's eyes. "I know. I'm not proud of what I did." Robert paused to gulp some coffee down and looked into the fire, grappling for the courage to continue with what he had to say next. Ryan was accused of stealing from the mercantile store by the son of the owner. He was too scared to tell me and Ma. He thought he'd bring shame on our family. He decided to settle the debt the same way I settled things. So without me knowing about it, he and the son had a fight. The son taunted him, said that if he was a real man, not a sickly child, he would fight it out, like his infamous older brother Robert Gilligan. Robert swallowed, and his voice cracked with emotion. Ryan was killed in that fight, and they left him to die in the dirt like an animal. I was hell-bent on revenge. Even more so when I discovered that there had never been any theft. It was all a lie, because the other boy was jealous of my reputation. I went looking for revenge and beat the boy so bad. He didn't die, but I wanted him to. Annie looked at Robert, not knowing what to say. "I'm so sorry about your brother, Robert. What happened?" "How did you?" "The sheriff told me and Ma that losing Ryan that way was punishment enough. And I prayed, Annie. I prayed like never before that the Lord would take the pain in my heart away. I should have done more to protect Ryan, to keep him safe and tell him that fighting was never the answer." Robert shook his head, trying to banish the image in his mind of Ryan's broken body and the bleak wind that blew across the land as they had buried him. "Poor Nora," Annie whispered. "And poor you too, Robert. You're not a bad person, I can tell. When we were standing by his graveside, I vowed I would never fight again, Annie. You have to believe me. I'm not that sort of man anymore." He gave Annie a searching look, wanting her to understand. "Finley coming here brought it all back to me, you see. My guilt that I hadn't saved my brother and kept him safe. I brought Ma to Blossom Creek not long after all that happened for a fresh start, and I've tried to do my best for her every day since then, to make amends." Annie reached across the gap between their 2 chairs and took Robert's hand. "Thank you for helping me understand." I thought, I thought that you only saw weakness and sickness when you looked at Finley. But he's more than that, Robert. I promise. When you get to know him, he's a bright boy who wants to do his best. I promised Ma that I would always look after him, and I'll do whatever I can to honor that promise. If seeing Finley is too painful for you because of your memories of Ryan, I'll understand. We'll leave as soon as the weather breaks, and you'll never have to think of us again. Annie's voice trembled, but there was a determined look in her eye. I can't marry a man who would always feel that Finley was a burden or a disappointment. I'm sorry, Robert, but I won't do that to him. I don't feel like that, Annie, Robert implored. Give me a bit of time, is all I ask. Let me get to know Finley properly. Who knows, once he gets better, maybe he'll be strong enough to help me now and again. I'd like that. Annie stood up and stretched as a wave of exhaustion swept over her. Let's see what the next few weeks bring, shall we? Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot and we can start again? As she lay down to snatch an hour's sleep before starting her morning chores, Annie felt more confused than ever. There was so much about Robert that she didn't know. He seemed like a good man, and she could feel her attraction to him growing, yet he had such violence in his past. Her brush with Everett's descent into the violent drunk he had become filled her with a wariness that it could happen again. Does a man ever really change? What if Robert is still the sort of person who might still decide to get ahead in life by fighting? The thoughts flickered insistently as sleep finally came and dark dreams chased through her mind. Chapter 11. I can't believe how quaint Blossom Creek looks. Annie's cheeks were flushed pink from the crisp winter air, and she twisted in the seat of the wagon to get a better look. I guess it is, now you come to mention it. Robert enjoyed seeing his hometown through new eyes, with Annie's enthusiasm, and he nodded. The houses are so pretty, and everything feels more leisurely here compared to New York. Where I lived, we only knew the people on our street, and they were friendly enough, but as soon as you walked 10 minutes into a different area, everyone treated each other like strangers. Annie waved back to a family who had given her a cheery wave and called out a greeting to Robert. Folks seem friendlier here, as if they care more about each other. It has its good points and bad, Robert chuckled. Some people can have a small-town attitude, where they like to know your business and tittle-tattle about you behind your back. But most folks here are friendly, like you say. No doubt, a few are already wondering when our wedding will be. I had to tell old Mrs. Jordan that everything was above board with Ma as our chaperone at the ranch. Annie flushed as the topic of marriage came up. A week had passed since Robert had confided in her, and now that the weather had improved, they were able to come into town and stock up on supplies. But she still didn't feel ready for them to be wed. There were still too many questions and doubts swirling around in her mind about whether Robert could ever grow to love Finley like family. Clearly, Robert still had doubts too, because although he had become friendlier toward Finley in the last week, talking to him more about the ranch now that Finley was up and about again, he hadn't mentioned marriage either. It's better not to rush these things, Nora had said the day before when she and Annie were cooking. Robert can be as stubborn as a mule sometimes, and he needs to realize that Ryan's death wasn't his fault. More to the point, he needs to realize that he can give you and Finley a good life at Pine Tree Ranch. She had wiped her soapy hands on her apron and turned to take Annie's hands, looking deep into her eyes. Don't judge him harshly, Annie. Ryan's death shook him real bad for a long time. He doesn't trust himself again yet. I reckon seeing Finley so ill, the fact that we nearly lost him with that fever, he's worried he might not be able to save Finley if something bad happened, just like he felt about Ryan. Annie replayed Nora's words through her mind, over and over again, as the wagon rattled toward Blossom Creek. She longed to be able to reassure Robert, but knew that there was no point. He had his own demons to fight, and he had to reach the right conclusion by himself, not just to please her. The last thing she wanted was for Robert to marry her out of obligation, that she had traveled out to the ranch rather than for love. She thought back to what her mother had always said, "Marry a man who you love and who loves you back, Annie." Plenty of girls marry for money, but when you love each other and you follow God's plan, that's how to have a rich life, even if you're not wealthy financially. Annie had always vowed that she would heed her mother's words, and she could feel the stirrings of love for Robert. But she needed a sign that Robert felt the same way before they could be wed. Here we are. I'll show you around so you'll know where to buy the supplies, and then we could go to the coffee shop. I mean, would you like to take coffee with me while we're here? Robert hitched the horse and helped Annie down from the wagon, stumbling over his invitation. Why, thank you, cowboy. I'd like that very much, Annie replied with a giggle. Robert shot her a grin that made her heart skip a beat. He stood a head taller than her, and as they strolled along the main street, he pointed out the different establishments and introduced her to some of his friends and acquaintances. Annie noticed several of the town's ladies gave him flirtatious glances, hoping to catch his eye. You seem to know everyone, Annie commented as a dark-haired woman flashed a hungry stare in Robert's direction before hurrying on. You didn't want to marry one of the ladies already out here? The question popped out before Annie had a chance to stop herself. I didn't think any of them would be interested, Robert replied with a shrug. There are plenty of men with better prospects than me out here, and I've mainly been working hard on making a better life for Ma, since Ryan, you know. They walked on in companionable silence, and Annie reflected on the way that Robert was determined to make up for his past. It was a trait she admired, and she felt the tug of attraction toward him grow stronger still. She glanced up at him as he paused to look in the window of the mercantile store. The scars on his face and misshapen nose from his fighting days meant that it would be easy to mistake him for an aggressive, thuggish sort of man, even with his dark good looks. But she was starting to realize that there was a lot more to Robert Gilligan than met the eye. Beneath his rugged exterior was a warmth and kindness he rarely showed, and the way he cared for Nora showed Annie that he was a deeply loyal person to those whom he loved. The thought gave her comfort, and she felt her pulse quicken as he suddenly caught her eye and a spark of attraction passed between them. Ah! I wondered if we would see you in town with your good lady now that the snows let up for a brief while. A plump woman stood in the doorway of the mercantile store and beckoned them inside. She grasped Annie's hand and shook it enthusiastically. I'm Myrtle Sutton, and that man perched at the top of the ladder, he's got no business to be climbing with his bad back, is my husband Thomas. Her eyes twinkled with amusement. Aren't you going to introduce us, Robert? This is Annie Doyle, Myrtle, and yes, we were snowed in at the ranch for weeks, so we're low on supplies. Ma's written a list. Robert handed Myrtle a scrap of paper, and she bustled away to gather the items that Nora wanted. I hope he's treating you to something too, Annie, Thomas called. Annie grinned and raised an eyebrow, shooting Robert a questioning look. Well, he hasn't said. What about some dried fruits to make a wedding cake? We got some in on a new delivery from the train just this morning, and I've got some lovely lace too, perfect for trimming a new shawl, perhaps? Myrtle chuckled as Robert's cheeks turned a shade pinker. Don't mind us, dear, she added in a loud whisper to Annie. We've known Robert and Nora since they arrived in Blossom Creek, and he knows our jesting is in good nature. It's lovely to welcome you here, too. Annie strolled around the store, admiring how well stocked it was. She had thought it would be harder to buy necessities out west, but it seemed that you could get whatever you needed from the hard-working storekeepers of the town. We were hoping you'd call in. Someone's been looking for you. Thomas paused from his task and looked at Myrtle, who nodded, her jovial expression suddenly looking more serious. Thomas is right. He was a rough-looking man. Called in a couple of days ago. Myrtle closed her eyes briefly, trying to picture him again. Brown hair, older than you. Not from around here, but his accent was hard to place. She shivered and peered out at the street again. I don't want to worry you, Robert, but he didn't seem like the sort of man you'd want to have come looking for you, if you get what I mean. No offense, and we don't like to pry, but he seemed like trouble. Robert's expression stayed neutral as he took in this news. Did he say what he wanted? Nope. Thomas rubbed the crick in his back as he stepped off the bottom rung of the ladder. All he asked us was whether we could tell him where Pine Tree Ranch was. We asked him why he wanted to know, and he clammed up mighty quick. Looked sort of shifty, too. Then another customer came in, and before we had a chance to say any more, he'd gone, Myrtle added. He was heading toward the saloon by the look of it. We've kept an eye out, but we haven't seen him since. I know you're pretty remote up that track of yours, but there's no telling what might happen if someone's got a grudge to settle. Just keep a lookout and make sure you're prepared for the worst is all. The weather's mighty changeable as well. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't get more snow again before the week's out. Annie felt a shiver of apprehension trickle down her spine as she listened to the conversation from the far corner of the store, and Myrtle noticed the way her face had paled. This stranger, did you happen to notice whether one of his arms was damaged? Annie asked Myrtle quietly, as Robert settled up the bill with Thomas. Myrtle turned her back slightly on the men and drew Annie to one side. It was hard to tell. He was bundled up in a heavy coat, and he kept his hands in his pockets. She darted a concerned look at Robert before continuing. We all have people from our past, dear. Thomas and I know that more than most. But if you're running from something, or someone, we'd hate to see Robert and Nora come to any harm. Honesty is the best policy, don't you think? She accompanied her words with a smile to show Annie she meant no malice. I appreciate what you're saying, Mrs. Sutton, Annie whispered. I only want the best for Robert and his mother, too. Trust me. Sounds like we're of the same mind, then, Myrtle said with a grin, her good mood restored. I hear you've got a younger brother, too. News travels fast in Blossom Creek. Take this for him and tell him we'd love to meet him in person next time y'all come to town. She slipped a twist of peppermint sticks into Annie's basket with a wink and bustled away to open the door for an elderly lady who was struggling. As the wagon rumbled to a halt back at the ranch, Finley came running down the steps to greet them, making Annie's heart lift with pleasure at the welcome sight of her brother's enthusiasm. Nora said I was well enough to get up and come outside, he called. He reached up to take Annie's basket, and Ted bounced around his feet, dropping a stick on the ground for him to throw. This is a big step forward in your recovery, Robert said with a chuckle. When I was a boy, Ma used to say that getting out in the fresh air was the fastest way to get well again. Mind you, it might be short-lived now it's started snowing again. He turned his face upwards into the snowflakes that drifted lazily down from the dark clouds that had crept across the sky during their journey home. Stay in the warmth for a few days longer, Finley. I know you're itching to help Robert with the animals, but there will be plenty of time for that once we know you're completely well again. Annie saw the smile curve on Robert's mouth as she spoke of the future and tried to push her worries about the stranger in town to one side. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Nora chivied Finley to bed when he couldn't keep his eyes open any longer, then headed off for an early night herself as well, too, leaving the two of them peacefully by the fire. The clock ticked in the corner as Annie worked her way through the pile of mending, and Robert whittled wood with his knife. It's something for Finley, he explained when Annie asked what he was making. My pa made something similar for me when I was a boy, and I thought I'd do the same. He glanced up at Annie, looking at the way her copper curls gleamed in the firelight, and knew that he had to tell her how he felt, sooner rather than later. I was thinking, Robert, there's something I need to tell you about the stranger Myrtle and Thomas spoke about. Annie's words came out in a rush, and she seemed too lost in her own emotions to have heard what Robert had started to say. Robert put his whittling to one side and gave her his attention. I'm worried it might be Everett, come looking for us. Annie's eyes darkened as she remembered the way he had looked so desperate to pay off his debts to Mr. Sawyer, the factory owner. Why would he come all this way? I know you hinted that he wasn't a very nice stepfather to you, Annie, but you cut all ties with him by coming out here, didn't you? I thought he would have been glad to only have himself to think of. I don't mean to sound harsh, but he sounds like a selfish sort of man. Yes, but the thing is, Annie broke off, struggling with how to tell Robert what she wanted to say. The thing is, Everett owed money through his gambling debts. I think it must have been more than he dared admit to. It's a terrible curse to get drawn into something like that, but as bad as it sounds, you and Finley leaving would give him less to worry about, not having to support a family. Robert shot her a sympathetic smile. But Finley was his way out of the debt, Robert. That's what I'm trying to explain, and not doing a very good job of it. He promised Mr. Sawyer that Finley would work at his factory, for nothing, to pay off all the money he owed him. Annie stood up and hurried to check that the door was locked, feeling suddenly fearful of who might be lurking outside in the dark. So what you're saying is... What I'm saying is that Everett was a desperate man when Finley and I fled from New York. He pretty much sold Finley to pay for his debts, and I doubt if Mr. Sawyer is someone who would look charitably on a debt not being settled. I see. Robert stood up and walked to Annie's side. I didn't tell you the whole story because I didn't want you to think I only came out here to escape Everett. Maybe to start with it swayed my decision. But through your letters, and now I've gotten to know you better, Robert, I feel like I'm falling. Don't say it, Annie. Robert gently placed a finger on Annie's lips, stopping her from uttering the words he longed to hear. Before you think it's all your fault, I need to explain something to you as well. He took hold of Annie's hands and looked into her eyes, seeking forgiveness. When I told you I beat the boy who killed Ryan, what I didn't say is that the following week, when I took Ma from that terrible place to give her a better life here, the sheriff came to see us as we were leaving. He told me the boy's father had sworn he would get his revenge one day. Even though his son had killed Ryan, the way he saw it was that Ryan deserved it and his son could do no wrong. I'm sorry, Robert. What a wicked thing for him to think after you lost your brother. Annie lifted one of her hands and stroked the side of Robert's face, letting her fingers trace the scars that would always remind him of his past. I always thought coming somewhere this far away would keep Ma safe, and now I want to make sure I can keep you and Finley safe as well. But, I guess I'll always have one eye looking over my shoulder, just in case he comes looking. Can you forgive me, Annie? I want to offer you safety, but I don't think I can. His words hung between them, and the flames in the hearth flickered as a gust of wind howled outside, casting ghoulish shadows on the wall behind them. Suddenly, Ted leaped up from where he had been snoozing by the fire and ran to the door with a low growl. His hackles raised and his lip curled back in a snarl as a shadow passed across the window. There was somebody outside. "Let me in!" The sound of a fist hammering violently on the door pounded through the house, and a deep voice shouted the command again. "Let me in." Chapter 12. Who's there? Finley stumbled through from his bedroom, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Annie? Whoever it is sounds angry. Don't worry, Finley. I'm not going to let anyone here come to harm. Robert pulled Annie behind him and looked for his rifle before realizing he had left it in the barn earlier. The hammering on the door got louder. Are you hiding in there, Annie? I need to speak to you. Finley gasped and shot Annie a horrified look as they both recognized the voice. It's Pa? What's he doing here? Robert turned and gave the boy a reassuring nod. Annie's explained everything I need to know about Everett. Let me deal with this. He unlocked the door and swung it open to reveal the disheveled figure standing outside. Annie, you in there? Everett shook the thick coating of snow from his shoulders and tried to peer past Robert into the softly lit living room. I don't mean any harm, Annie, but I need to talk to you. His voice had a pleading tone that Annie had never heard before. Don't make me go back there. Finley's anguished cry ripped through the air, and he barreled past Robert and Everett, racing down the steps into the night. I'm never going back to that awful factory. The thickly falling snow muffled his voice, and Annie cried out in terror as the inky darkness swallowed him up. Come back, Finley. It's not safe for you to be out there alone. Robert pushed past Everett, but it was too late. The swirling snow had already erased Finley's footsteps, and he was nowhere to be seen. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare anyone. Everett stepped hesitantly into the light just as Nora appeared, pulling her shawl tightly over her nightgown. Annie, I don't mean any trouble. I got a ride with a traveling merchant from Blossom Creek, and then I walked up the track. I would have waited until the morning to speak to you, but the snow was falling so fast I thought I might lose my way, and then I saw the lights in the window here." He shot an apologetic look at Robert. "What do you want with us, Everett? We don't belong to you anymore. We've made a new life. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to find Finley." Annie pulled one of Robert's old buckskin coats over her dress and picked up the hurricane lamp, ready to go out into the darkness. Her eyes flashed with determination as she waited for Everett to step aside out of her way. "If Finley gets ill again, I'll never forgive you, Pa." "Wait, Annie. Let me say what I need to." Everett lunged to grab Annie, but before he could reach her, Robert leaped forward and blocked his way. "Get away from her," he shouted. "I won't ever let you hurt them again, Everett. You deserve to go to hell for what you put Annie and Finley through." Robert's face darkened with barely concealed anger, and his fists bunched in a long-forgotten reflex as he pulled back his arm to punch Everett. "No, Robert, don't. You'll regret it." Annie jumped forward and put a restraining hand on his arm, feeling the sinewy muscles coiled for action beneath his shirt. "Fighting isn't the answer. Not for Everett or anyone. Remember the promise you made to yourself." She looked deep into his eyes, seeing the temptation and torment chasing through their brown depths. "You're right, Annie. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure nobody ever hurts you or Finley again." Robert exhaled and dropped his fist back to his side as Everett stumbled backward and sat heavily on the nearest chair. "I came to apologize, Annie." Everett's strangled confession came out in a hoarse whisper, and he dropped his head into his hands. "I became a terrible man. The drink, the gambling. It was everything Sylvia would have hated." He looked up and blinked as though waking from a nightmare. "I came to ask for your forgiveness and to see if I could make amends." Annie gasped as Everett's unexpected words hung in the air between them. "Robert, Annie, you two must go and find Finley. That's what matters more than anything right now," Nora said firmly. "Don't you worry about Everett. Leave him here with me and go and find that darling boy of ours. Take Ted with you. That dog loves him so much, he'll sniff him out. I'm sure he hasn't gone far. He just had a shock, is all." Nora's words galvanized Annie and Robert into action, and they sped off into the snowy darkness with Ted yapping excitedly, nose firmly to the ground. I'm sorry. I wanted to do the right thing, and I've messed up. May the Lord forgive me." Everett muttered quietly to himself, slumped in the chair. "If you're genuinely remorseful, I'm sure the good Lord will find a way for you to make amends for your actions," Nora said briskly. "I reckon you could do with a cup of coffee, Mr. Doyle. You could make yourself useful by putting some logs on the fire, and then we'll have a chat about what you plan to do to honor your late wife's memory. If Annie and Finley are anything to go by, I can tell she was a good woman, and I know losing the person you loved can lead you to a dark place until you find God's light again." She gave Everett a steady look and saw his eyes flicker with a sadness she recognized from when she had lost her own husband all those years ago. "Thank you, ma'am. And yes, Sylvia was a wonderful woman who I was lucky to call my wife. I'm ashamed of the way the drink led me astray, but all I can hope is that the Lord and Annie and Finley can forgive me." "Finley, come out. Everett's not here to take us back to New York." "You're safe, Finley. Let's get you back in the warm again." Annie and Robert's shouts rang out in the darkness as they plowed through the deepening snow. The flakes were falling so dizzyingly fast that the beam of light from their lamps barely pierced the gloom. "Finley, where are you?" Annie's voice was edged with fear as her mind imagined him lying in a snowdrift, slipping away into a sleep he would never awaken from. She could feel the panic rising in her chest. "Have faith, Annie." Robert loomed next to her and put his arm protectively around her shoulder. He closed his eyes briefly, straining to hear the slightest sound that might tell them where Finley could be. "Lord, I beseech you to bring Finley safely back to us. Please help him in your gracious benevolence, O Lord, so that I may marry Annie and give her and Finley the happy home they deserve. I promise I will never give in to the temptation to fight again, Lord. I will keep my vow and walk in your righteousness to live a good life in your honor." His whispered prayer drifted into the night, and he opened his eyes to find Annie giving him a searching look. The snowflakes had settled like spangled stars on her face, and he knew in that moment that he loved her more than he had ever imagined possible. There, look! Annie suddenly noticed Ted scrabbling at the wheels of the wagon. The dog started yapping loudly and scrabbled at the mound of snow with renewed vigor, sending a shower of it up through his back legs. Finley must have hidden under the wagon. Robert sprinted to where Ted was digging and threw himself on the ground, scooping great handfuls of the snow out as well. "He's here, Annie. Finley, are you all right? Can you speak?" "Robert, I didn't mean to run away, but I never want to leave the ranch. Please don't make me go." Annie felt her heart soar with relief as she heard Finley's stuttered reply as he crawled out from the burrow he had made beneath the wagon's wheels. "Never, Finley. You have my word. Why would I make you leave when you're going to be my right-hand man here at Pine Tree Ranch? Not to mention, we've got a wedding to plan." Robert heaved Finley into his arms and stood up with a jubilant laugh. "He'll be fine, Annie. We'll be fine." Annie held the lamp up higher and said a silent prayer as she saw that although Finley looked cold and shocked, there was nothing worse wrong with him. Ted bounded up and down, then raced in circles around them all, his tail wagging with ecstasy. Robert put Finley carefully back on his feet, draped his coat over the boy's shoulders, and propelled him toward the comforting lights of the homestead, where Nora stood waiting with a blanket. He turned to face Annie again and placed both of their lamps on the ground before brushing the snow from her auburn curls and sweeping her into a passionate embrace. "Will you marry me, Annie? I don't think I could bear to lose you and Finley. I've wanted to ask you from the moment you came to help me in the barn. I'm just a stubborn fool who couldn't get the words out." "If you're a fool, then so am I," Annie replied with a chuckle. "I reckon we both had some figuring out to do about each other, is all." She stood on tiptoe and lightly brushed her hand across the scars on Robert's cheek, seeing the desire flare in his eyes. Her heart skipped a beat as his mouth curved into a smile. "I love you, Robert. And yes, we've got a wedding to plan. Yes, I will be your wife." As Robert gathered her into another embrace and brushed her lips with his, she felt giddy with love as the blood fizzed in her veins. The swirling snow danced over them, uniting them as one beneath its sparkling white canopy, and Annie knew there was nowhere she would rather be than by Robert's side for the rest of their lives. Epilogue. Blossom Creek, Montana. 1 year later. The colorful leaves rustled under the wheels of their wagon as they rounded the corner, and Blossom Creek came into view. It was one of those rare late fall days when the sky was brilliant blue, and every tree looked as though it was on fire, with the sun sparkling through the red and gold leaves. "I can't believe it's been a year already since we came here." Finley waved at his friends, John and Clara Hopkins, who were already hurrying toward the park with their parents. "I think I've crammed more into the last 12 months than the preceding 5 years put together," Robert replied with a chuckle. "And to think, we were almost too stubborn to see what the good Lord had planned for us." Annie leaned against Robert, feeling the solidity of his body against hers, and let her thoughts drift. After Robert's proposal a year ago, the weather had miraculously cleared again for a week, so they booked their wedding without further ado, not wanting to wait for the rest of the winter if the weather turned bad again. She remembered the night before the wedding when Nora had taken her to one side. "I've been sewing this in my bedroom in secret, ready for when you both came to your senses." She had presented Annie with a beautiful lace-edged shawl in the palest ivory, which had brought tears of surprise and gratitude to her eyes. Nora had hugged her tight before adding, "I know you would have wanted your mother to be here, but I hope you'll let me take that role, now that the Lord has taken her back to heaven. I used to wish I had a daughter, and I think my wishes came true the day you came here, Annie." The very next Sunday, Pastor Wallace had pronounced them man and wife after a short ceremony, and Robert had never felt so proud as the moment Annie committed to being his wife, gazing up at him with her stunning green eyes. And now, a year later, Annie felt as though Pine Tree Ranch had been her home forever. The people of Blossom Creek and the surrounding countryside had accepted her and Finley as their own, and she knew she would never want to live anywhere else. Do you think I could have a toffee apple? Finley was excited to be attending Blossom Creek's first fall celebration event, and Nora had pressed a couple of coins into his hand for some treats when they had left. Annie nodded as Robert brought their wagon to a halt. Finley jumped down and hitched their horse to the rail without needing to be asked, before darting away to join the stream of people strolling toward the park. Nora was right. The fresh air has done him a world of good, Annie said, noticing how much he had shot up in the last few months. Finley was no longer the pale, sickly-looking boy who had left New York. Now his cheeks were brown and freckled with good health, and he was turning into a strong, healthy young man, learning something new on the ranch almost every day with Robert's patient tuition. He's certainly taken to country life, Robert agreed. In the spring, he'll be ready to have a horse of his own and help me with the cattle drive up to the summer pastures. We'll make a proper little rancher of him, Annie. He's got the patience to work with animals that not everyone has, and I'm blessed that he's part of our family. He put his arm around Annie and pulled her close, brushing a kiss on the top of her head. We're all blessed, Robert. Annie was suddenly overcome with emotion, and she felt a lump in her throat as tears of happiness pricked her eyes. There you are. Quick, Fred. Look who's arrived. Charity Hopkins bustled toward them with a beaming smile, and Fred hurried to catch his wife up. Congratulations, Annie. And you too, Robert, Fred added, slapping his friend on the back. Are you going to introduce us? Robert put his arm around Annie again and gently pulled the edge of the shawl back from where a tiny baby nestled cozily in Annie's arms. Fred, Charity, meet our daughter, Sylvia May. His heart burst with love as he looked down at the cherub who opened her eyes and waved her hand in the air, startled by the chilly breeze which had awoken her. Wisps of coppery-colored hair framed her heart-shaped face, and her dark eyes gazed up at him with a serious look. Annie, Finley, and now Sylvia May, the Lord has blessed me with so much happiness in my life, he added with a whisper that only Annie heard as a powerful wave of love passed between them. I told you, Robert. Remember, when we met in town last fall, we always knew you'd make a wonderful family man, didn't we, Fred? Robert grinned as the band struck up a lively tune in the park's bandstand. We don't want to miss all the fun. Let's go. As Annie and Robert followed their friends toward the festivities, they suddenly spotted Everett hurrying in their direction. He waved and ran the last few yards. I'm mighty glad I caught you both, he said with a breathless smile. I finished carving the crib, and I'll be bringing it out to the ranch next Sunday afternoon. If that's okay? Annie gave him a warm smile and nodded. Of course, Everett, and thank you for your kindness. It's a very special gift from her grandpa. They walked in companionable silence for a few moments, and Annie marveled at how much life had changed for her stepfather, too. After they'd gotten over the shock of seeing him at Pine Tree Ranch, Annie had prayed for guidance. In the long hours that she had considered his apology, she had realized that everyone deserves a second chance. Although it hadn't always been easy, she had learned to trust him again. He had vowed never to drink again, and much to her surprise, had declared that he was staying in Blossom Creek, where Mr. Evans had offered him a job with lodgings at the feed and seed store. Sylvia would have been so proud of everything you've achieved, Annie. Everett peeked into the crook of her arms, and his gaze softened as he looked at the baby. Annie squeezed Everett's arm and smiled. She would have been proud of you too, Everett. It took a lot of courage to admit your failings and choose a better path. The baby gurgled and waved a pudgy fist as the leaves of the trees rustled over them, and they both laughed. I reckon I need to get after Finley and give him some tips for the apple bobbing, Everett said, hurrying away. Funny how things work out, isn't it? Robert lifted his hat as Mrs. Booth walked past, walking her dog, Cupid, and she gave them a small wink before bustling away to speak to two new ladies who had just arrived in Blossom Creek. I forgot to tell you, in all the excitement of Sylvia May being born, the sheriff had a visitor from where Ma and I used to live. It was their sheriff, as it happens. He told me that the father of the boy who fought with Ryan had passed away after a short illness. He reckoned I'd like to know. Annie turned to Robert and gave him a searching look. His deep brown eyes that crinkled at the edge when he laughed held no hint of revenge or anger anymore. He had finally forgiven himself for what had happened all those years ago. "I'm so happy for you, Robert." Annie stroked his cheek and felt her heart skip a beat with joy and desire. Her husband was a good man, and he had found peace. Now they could look forward to a life filled with happiness, hard work, and love, together, without fearing the past might catch up with them. As the residents of Blossom Creek gathered to celebrate fall, Annie gave thanks in her heart for all the blessings in their lives. She had never dared hope for the great happiness she felt in this moment. But standing next to her husband, surrounded by new friends and neighbors, she felt filled with optimism for their future together. There might be hard times, but they would meet them together, and that was what mattered. Deciding to be a mail-order bride might have seemed like a desperate escape at the time, but it had turned out to be the best decision of her life. She had prayed for hope and help many times over the last couple of years, and she knew without a doubt that the Lord's hand had guided her to Robert and Pine Tree Ranch. As Robert had said, when you trust in the Lord, life has a way of working out. They truly were blessed. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way, you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.